stage is set for an explosive confrontation where betrayal, loyalty, and vengeance collide. No one escapes untouched. Greg loved to run. He ran to school every morning, no matter the weather. Even the chilly November air today didn't stop him from enjoying his exercise. After all, that's what his warm running gear was made for. His running tights fit snugly, keeping him warm with soft fleece lining. They were black with bright flames in red and orange that twisted around his legs. He felt speedy when he wore them. Every day he would run, take a shower at school, and change before class. This routine gave him strength, speed, and stamina, which were important for being the star wide receiver on his high school football team. Thanks to the quarterback's strong and accurate throws, they had led the team to the championships. Today's game would determine the state champion. As he ran the last blocks toward the school, he felt great. His good mood might have come from the night before when he'd been invited into his girlfriend's room for the first time. She had asked him to come over for an important talk, but then took him upstairs right away. She had smiled at him while sitting on her bed. He had looked around her room, noting the posters of boy bands and actors, which was exactly what he expected. He wondered how he fit into her world since he didn't look like them. Watching her smile at him, he hoped she liked more than just one thing about him. When she sat up and grinned, she surprised him by asking him to stand so she could help him. Coming back to the present, he crossed a busy street and waved at a few friends in their cars, waiting for the light. As he continued, he chuckled at the memory of the exciting night before. Though things hadn't gone exactly as he had imagined, it had still been a step forward in their relationship. Crystal had been hesitant to give him more than sweet kisses and let him appreciate her beauty. He thought it might be a sign that she was struggling with certain feelings. He had done some research to understand her behavior better. This morning he felt hopeful. Then he remembered his meeting with Crystal's older half-sister Candace the night before. After their time together, he had to clean up in the bathroom down the hall since he couldn't use the one in Crystal's room. Was it a special place? As he left the bathroom, he accidentally bumped into Candace. She had long blonde hair dyed a soft pink, which she used to cover part of her face. He thought the side she showed was pretty, but he sensed she was uncomfortable with showing her scars. She looked at him in a different way, so he smiled and said hello. He worried she might have heard what happened earlier. Her stare lingered, and then, to his surprise, she pushed her hair away to reveal the other side of her face. He was amazed she was trusting him enough to do that. He noticed a noticeable scar running down the right side of her face, starting above her brow and ending at her jawline, with smaller scars following. He looked into her nervous blue eyes and smiled back. Then she made a quick noise and hurried off to her room. Watching her leave, he felt sorry for her. He remembered how smart she was before the accident that caused her scars. Greg jogged through the school grounds and waved to Mr. Marcy, the football coach. The coach smiled and waved back. Greg knew he was excited about the game that day, too. He greeted some friends as he walked to the gym and shower area. He saw Crystal with her friends, Heather, who was dating Tim, the quarterback, and Valerie, who was with Pete, a defensive player. Crystal was a stunning redhead, and she made his heart race when she smiled at him. But today she wasn't smiling as she talked with her friends, so he decided to approach them, hoping to bring back her smile. "Hey, beautiful! Hi, Heather, Valerie," he said cheerfully, focusing on Crystal. She glanced down his athletic build, taking in his strong shoulders and toned legs, which were visible in his running tights. The cold November air barely touched his face, which glistened from a light sweat. Her nostrils flared as he leaned in for a quick kiss. He received a quick kiss instead of the soft one he had hoped for, and gave her a surprised look as he pulled back. "You're sweaty," she said, shifting a bit awkwardly. He smiled uncertainly, not sure why she seemed hesitant. She had said before that she liked his scent. "I just ran to school," he explained. "You should clean up before the first bell," she suggested, clearly wanting to end the conversation. He nodded and moved away, replaying the brief exchange in his mind as he walked to the gym. What was that about? He wondered as he entered the shower room. He put his backpack in a locker, took off his running clothes, and stuffed them inside. He grabbed his shampoo, soap, and towel. He quickly cleaned himself in the showers, washing his long, straight black hair that hung down to his shoulders. Once rinsed, he returned to thinking about Crystal's reaction. As he dried off and got dressed, an older worry came back to him. When Crystal first started dating him, he was very aware of how different their families were. Greg's family, the Hughes, owned a small software company. Most of their customers were from Europe and Asia. His dad traveled a lot for work, sometimes leaving Greg and his mom at home for weeks. While that wasn't ideal, Greg felt secure knowing his parents were happily married. Their business did well enough for them to live comfortably. In contrast, Crystal came from a wealthy family. Her father, Byron Tafferty, was the richest businessman in the area, maybe even the state. He owned all the mines and mining rights in their county and nearby areas. The Tafferty family helped build the town of Hampstead Hills nearly a century ago and played a big role in its growth. Greg worried that one day Crystal would realize she deserved someone from her own social class. Even though she told him she was happy, the worry never fully went away. The Tafferty family, once very influential, had shrunk to just 5 members. Byron, now in his 60s, was still a strong and clever businessman. It was said that he could be harsh, and Greg had come to believe those stories based on Crystal's tales. Byron was married to his second wife, Missy, who was tall and attractive, married shortly after the passing of his first wife, Ellie. Missy, now in her mid-30s, was the reason Crystal had her striking red hair and beauty. The 18-year-old daughter hadn't inherited her mother's more prominent features, but she was a slender version of her. Cal Tafferty, now 25, was Byron's eldest child. Ellie gave birth to her second child, Candace, but sadly she passed away during the delivery. Candace was now 21 years old. The Tafferty home was a large 8-bedroom mansion in the Oak Hills neighborhood. It was much bigger than the Hughes family's 2-bedroom house on Aspen Grove Crescent, which was on the other side of town. From what Crystal said in his own brief encounters with the man, Greg thought Cal was quite unpleasant. He was selfish, proud, and acted like he deserved everything. He relied on his family's money and status in the community. Once a popular quarterback in high school, he was now slipping into a troubled life, struggling with drinking. It was clear to anyone who saw him, and Greg believed Cal knew it too, but didn't know how to change. Candace had a sadder story, but Crystal didn't want to talk about her half-sister, especially when it came to recent events. Since Candace lost her mother at birth, she and her brother were mostly raised by the household staff. Missy looked after her own daughter under Byron's direction. Crystal had mentioned that her father blamed Candace for Ellie's death, even though Ellie had also faced difficulties giving birth to Cal. During her early years, Candace found comfort with the cook who cared for her until Byron discovered this and fired the cook that same day. This made Crystal upset as well. While Cal barely managed to keep up with his schoolwork, focusing more on football and his friends, Candace was very bright but struggled to connect with others. No one really liked her because her sharp comments pushed people away. She was smarter than most and made sure everyone knew it. Adding to this perception, she was also much taller than her peers. Candace started growing taller at a young age, setting her apart from other kids. She was always the tallest in her classes, and unfortunately, other children teased her, giving her the nickname Taffy for her height. By the time she graduated, she stood 6'2" with long, golden blonde hair. She often hid her face behind her hair. Tall and slim, she worked out in her home gym to keep fit and took care of her back because of her height. Despite how beautiful she was, she spent her high school years feeling alone. After graduating, Cal began to struggle with drinking. A few years later, Candace graduated at the top of her class but had no friends. This was where Crystal usually stopped talking and changed the subject, but Greg learned the story from people who knew. The year Candace graduated, there was a big party for her classmates, and, to everyone's surprise, she arrived in a taxi. Even though she tried to join in, no one talked to her, and she ended up drinking until she fell asleep on a porch swing. When she woke up, the party was ending, and someone had taken money from her wallet. She couldn't pay for the taxi home, so she called her family for a ride. Cal came to pick her up, having had a few drinks himself. He got her into his car and drove away quickly, not paying much attention. The next morning, people in town heard that Cal had crashed the car into a tree, and Candace was in the hospital with serious injuries. When Candace finally woke up, she showed signs of major brain injuries. She was no longer the smart young woman she used to be. She now acted like a young child. The sadness of it made Greg feel uneasy. The bell rang, bringing Greg back to the present. He had been sitting on the bench in the locker room, lost in thought. He quickly finished getting ready and hurried off to class. He would think about what was bothering Crystal later. "No, Candy, you can't go into the maternity ward," the nurse said. Large blue eyes looked back at Nurse Hershey. She was not fond of Candace. The very idea of mental challenges made her uncomfortable. Candy tried to enter the ward again, but heard a sigh behind her. A hand grabbed her arm and pulled her back. Candy held onto the door. Another sigh came, followed by a stronger pull that hurt. The nurse was acting out of fear, and Candace tightened her grip on the door. Frustrated, she said, "If you're going to be like this, I'll get Margaret. She's the head nurse and will make sure you can't volunteer here anymore. Is that what you want?" Candy pouted but kept holding onto the door with her blue eyes wide. With a frustrated huff, Hershey let go of Candace's arm and stormed off. As soon as the nurse turned the corner, Candace quickly released the door and hurried in the opposite direction, leaving the maternity ward behind. She had 10 minutes if she timed it right. She slipped into the stairwell and ran down 2 flights. She carefully peeked out the door to make sure no one was around. Earlier that morning, she had confirmed that the hospital's security cameras were not working. She made her way to the records room and used the key she had made from one on the custodian's keychain. It was a master key that would let her inside. She quietly entered and hurried down the aisles, looking at the boxes on the shelves for the date of the accident. Finally, she spotted it in a corner at the back. She listened carefully, but all was silent. Then she took down the file box and quickly flipped through the pages until she found the records for that night. She snapped pictures of the pages without really looking at them. She didn't have time. After putting them back, she found the file for Cal. Again, she took pictures, trying not to focus on the pages. But one number caught her attention. A blood test showed a blood alcohol level of 0, 134. She paused for a moment, knowing her brother had been drunk, but this was proof. It showed that the local sheriff's department had hidden information from their own test at the scene. They had overlooked the hospital's records. She quickly put the papers back into the box and returned it to the shelf. Looking at her watch, she realized she only had 3 minutes left. She retraced her steps to the maternity ward entrance and sat on the floor next to the door, resting her head on her knees. Taking deep breaths, she reminded herself of the saddest time she had, like the day the family cook was let go. "There she is! I told you!" a voice called out. "Be quiet. Let me talk to her," another voice replied. A gentle hand touched her dyed pink hair, and she looked up to see Margaret Stewart, the head nurse of the hospital. The older woman noticed the tears in her blue eyes. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, with a caring Scottish accent. "My arm hurts," Candace replied softly. Margaret raised her eyebrows and carefully rolled up Candy's sleeve. She saw bruises from Nurse Hershey's tight grip, clear marks from fingers. Margaret lifted Candy's chin to meet her gaze. "Who did this?" Candy's eyes shifted to Hershey standing nearby. "She doesn't like me," she whispered. Margaret sighed. "Did you try to go into the maternity ward?" "Just at the doorway, to listen to the babies," Candy replied quietly. "All right, I'll talk to Nurse Hershey. For now, please stay away from the maternity ward." Candy opened her mouth as if to argue, then nodded instead. Margaret helped her stand, and Candy glanced at Hershey, who looked frustrated. "She promised not to go into the maternity ward. Let's talk to the nurses inside. I also need to discuss the bruises on Miss Tafferty's arm," Margaret said calmly, as Hershey reacted with disbelief. The head nurse stressed Candace's family name as a warning. Although some saw her as different, she was still a Tafferty. Candy walked away, feeling less worried about the nurses. In her mind, she was planning her next steps. She felt bad for having used Mrs. Stewart's kindness. She had come to see that the strict woman had a gentle side. Once she reached her goal, she would sincerely apologize. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she knew it was necessary. It had taken her 2 years to get to this stage, as she needed to be patient with her plan. She frequently visited the hospital, and people mostly overlooked her bright pink hair. She moved from room to room with a small cart full of books and games for the patients. Sometimes she just sat with the elderly, allowing them to share their thoughts and feel calmer. Doctors and nurses appreciated her presence. She noticed that people accepted her now. Her sharp mind no longer intimidated them, and she controlled her sharp tongue so she was liked. This was a new and enjoyable experience for her. However, tricking them was starting to feel wrong, but she had a purpose. Getting the master key was a challenge, but she had the freedom to explore. The staff had grown used to her wandering in the basement, and usually directed her back to the elevators unless they were busy. They had a key-cutting machine, and they let her watch them use it. She knew where the master keys were stored and managed to borrow a set during lunchtime when the head staff member took a nap. Luckily, the noise covered the sound of her making the key. She returned the keys before he woke. With the important photos safe on her phone and her shift over, Candace headed home. A bus would pick her up near the hospital and take her to her neighborhood. While she waited, she looked back at the hospital, realizing she wouldn't have to wander its halls much longer. This thought made her feel odd. She had come to appreciate how people opened up to her. The loneliness she felt before faded within those walls. She noticed that when she listened more and spoke less, people felt comfortable around her. She remembered how she used to talk, with harsh words and judgments. This experience was teaching her things about herself she hadn't expected. Then, her memories drifted to the hard night after the accident when she woke up in pain and heard her father telling the doctor that there would be no more treatments for her injuries. He said the scars would be a punishment for her carelessness. She was taken aback by the harshness in his voice. She realized that night he wanted to let her go. He knew how smart she was, and probably worried that she would discover the financial plans he was making with the company's money and the workers' pension. She had a clear idea of what was going on, which supported her theory. At first, she wanted revenge against that terrible person. She planned to use Byron's wrongdoings against him. The best way to do this was to act like she needed him. This gave rise to her plan to pretend she was vulnerable. It was easy to stay quiet in the early days after she woke up. Acting like a simple child was harder, but her injuries helped her seem more convincing. It fit what the doctors expected. When a specialist came to evaluate her, Candace noticed that the woman had already formed an opinion based on what she heard. Candace easily passed the tests, since the expert wasn't looking for anything else. The bus brought her back to reality. The door opened and the driver smiled at her. She returned the smile. "Good evening, Candy," the driver said. "Good evening, Mr. Dillon," she replied. "Did you have a good day?" the older man asked. "The best yet," she answered, as she always did, making him chuckle. As she walked to her seat, she realized she would miss talking to him too. She found it hard to keep her smile, which worried her. Even though she had worked on her plan for 2 years, she had not thought about how important the relationships she built along the way would become. She didn't want to go back to being lonely. She would think about this issue more when she got home. Greg ran onto the field and joined the group. Tim gave him a big smile. "How about we start this game with a big play?" Tim suggested, making everyone laugh. "Do you want to surprise them right away?" Greg asked, pretending to be shocked. "It's the perfect time to show them what we're made of. Do you still have energy left, or are you tired from chasing Crystal?" Tim joked. "Look who thinks he's funny. Just throw the ball, smart guy," Greg replied with a grin. They high-fived and lined up for the play. Greg scanned the players he needed to get past. The cornerback and linebacker were ready to challenge him. He could definitely outrun the linebacker, but the cornerback was fast, so he needed to be careful. Tim called out the plays and Greg concentrated. He knew where he needed to go and when he had to get there. At the snap, he shot forward. As expected, the cornerback kept up, but the linebacker surprised him by running in a different direction. Greg pushed that thought aside and focused on increasing his speed, pulling ahead of the cornerback. It was time. He turned his head to the right to see the ball coming his way. His hands were ready to catch it when Tim watched in shock as the linebacker tackled Greg hard, hitting him on the side of his head and turning it to the left. In that moment, the cornerback crashed into Greg's legs. Tim saw Greg's body flip through the air as the football flew by him. Greg landed heavily on the ground. End of play. Greg slowly came back to awareness. His head throbbed. Everything hurt. He tried to remember what happened, but thinking made the pain worse. He might have made a sound of discomfort. "Mr. Hughes, are you awake?" Greg opened his eyes and squinted toward the voice. A person in a white coat was standing there. "Yes," he said softly. "Good. I'm Dr. Green. You've had a significant impact to your head, causing a concussion, which is why you feel so much pain. You also have a broken fibula in your left leg, but luckily, football season is over." Greg's heart raced as memories of the championship game flooded back. "The game!" he exclaimed, then fell back onto the pillow as the pain increased. "That was yesterday. You've been resting here since you arrived at the hospital. What is the last thing you remember?" "But take it easy," Dr. Green said gently. The pain surged as he tried to think. "Two went onto the field, and Tim said we were doing a long pass." His memory faded after that. "What happened?" The doctor smiled kindly. "From what I understand, the opposing team targeted you early on because they saw you as a threat. You were tackled by two of their players." Greg struggled to keep up, but it was tough. "What was the final score?" Dr. Green's smile widened. "I believe your team won." Greg managed a small smile before drifting back into unconsciousness. Dr. Green checked Greg's eyes and stepped out of the room. He needed to share good news with a worried parent. He walked down the hallway to the waiting area, where a group of anxious teens and a woman, Mrs. Hughes, were waiting for updates on Greg's health. He noticed Candy with her pink hair, looking a bit lost, and then saw her half-sister with red hair. "Mrs. Hughes?" he asked, and the nervous woman nodded. He gave her a comforting smile. "Greg is going to be fine. He has a concussion, so we will keep him here for a few days to monitor him. His left leg has a clean break which will heal in time and require a cast." "So no running for a while?" a tall blond man asked with a light-hearted grin aimed at easing Mrs. Hughes's worry. The doctor returned the smile. "No running for now." Mrs. Hughes sighed in relief, thankful for the good news. Hughes smiled at the blond man, gratitude shining in her eyes, even though they were a bit watery. "Can I see him?" "He's resting right now," he replied gently. "I think he'll be ready for visitors tomorrow. He had a bit of a rough time, so we'll keep the visits brief at first, okay?" The group nodded, and Mrs. Hughes shook his hand in thanks. With his job done, he moved on. From the corner of the waiting area, Candace watched Crystal with interest. The night before, she had overheard Crystal telling Missy that Greg had been hurt during the game. They were told to wait until morning to come to the hospital. Candace was surprised to see a mix of relief and guilt on her half-sister's face. She grew curious since she thought Crystal and Greg were a happy couple. She remembered the sounds coming from Crystal's room during Greg's last visit. It had sounded like they were very much in love. She made a note to remove the small listening device she had hidden in Crystal's room after hearing Greg would be stopping by. After listening in, Candace found herself waiting outside the restroom when Greg nearly bumped into her. She didn't think she would reveal her scars to him. When he smiled at her instead of looking away, she felt flustered and hurried off, her thoughts all jumbled. She'd heard Crystal mention their plans to come to the hospital today with friends, and she suspected Greg's mom would be there too. Candace made sure to be in the waiting area when they arrived. When she saw Greg's friend Tim, he greeted her with a friendly smile, but his girlfriend Heather seemed tense, much like how Crystal sometimes was. Candace and Crystal had never been close because their father had forbidden it. To keep Crystal safe from their father's anger, Candace kept her distance. With the doctor gone, Candace noticed that Greg's mom still looked worried. Tim hugged her and whispered something that made her smile when he let go. "Unlike Greg, who gets to relax today, some of us have part-time jobs that require us to work on Saturdays. We also need to share the good news since many people will want to know," Tim said, and everyone nodded along. Candace admired how Tim's reassuring words helped the woman feel stronger. His calmness made others feel at ease, unlike Cal, who could be a bit overwhelming. She expected Crystal to embrace Mrs. Hughes, but instead, Crystal was one of the first to leave the waiting area. This caught Mrs. Hughes off guard as she watched Crystal go. Without really knowing why, Candace stepped away from the wall and hugged Mrs. Hughes. At first, the older woman seemed surprised, but then she returned the embrace warmly. Hughes soon wrapped her arms around Candace, and they stood together in a warm embrace for a long moment. Candace gently let go and looked into Hughes's eyes to check if she was all right. "Thank you," Hughes said. "I don't think we've met before, but Greg brings everyone home." She smiled, thinking of her son. I'm Candy, aren't you supposed to be doing your rounds? Nurse Hershey interrupted firmly. Candace glanced at the nurse and quickly walked away. She didn't want to be near the unpleasant woman. Their last meeting had not gone well, and Nurse Hershey had been angry since then. Until Candace could complete her task, she knew she had to avoid her. She walked by Greg's room and paused outside the door for a moment. She promised herself she'd come back later to check on him. He was Crystal's boyfriend. Why did she feel so drawn to him? Crystal leaned back against the pillows on her bed. The redhead looked at her blonde friend Heather and noticed Valerie hiding her face behind her hair, likely feeling guilty about Mrs. Hughes. I'm just saying, as Greg's girlfriend, you should try to get along with his parents. She seems really nice, Heather said, trying to explain her earlier comment. Crystal huffed and crossed her arms. I've been trying to end things with him for a while. What? Why? Her friends exclaimed at the same time. Crystal motioned for them to quiet down. Once they calmed down, Heather spoke first. We thought you two were great together. You look so good as a couple, and he's handsome, Valerie chimed in. Is it because he comes from a different part of town? Her friends looked puzzled, so she explained. He lives east of Prentice Street, and we live west. Crystal frowned at her friend. That doesn't matter, and he's not poor. What other reason could you have for wanting to break up? Heather asked, surprised. Crystal felt uneasy under their intense stares. After a moment, she said, We just don't match well. You've been together? Valerie whispered as Heather looked shocked. No, Crystal retorted, pouting. It's just that we don't have the same connection. Heather and Valerie leaned in closer, curious. What do you mean? Valerie asked. Crystal sighed. Greg's always. Well, he's not the same all the time. She felt frustrated. I read about it. There are different types of guys regarding how they are. I don't feel a spark. Heather and Valerie exchanged confused glances before turning back to Crystal. What difference does that make? He's too big for me, Crystal complained. You keep saying that, and now I'm imagining something huge. Valerie giggled, making her friends laugh too. When the laughter faded, Crystal shook her head. He's maybe 7 inches long, but really thick. Too thick for me. You've tried? Heather asked gently. Crystal shook her head again. We haven't been together that way yet, but I know it won't fit, she said firmly. You mentioned wanting to break up weeks ago? What happened? Heather asked, as Valerie went back to imagining. Crystal looked at Heather. Every time I thought about ending it, I got scared. I always ended up being with him just one more time. You said you didn't go that far, Valerie remarked. We haven't, but Greg knows how to make me feel amazing. Crystal shivered at the memory. Valerie and Heather squealed with excitement, and Crystal joined them. Once they calmed down, Heather leaned closer. He's really that good. Crystal nodded with a smile that soon faded. If only he would do it without asking for something in return. Wait! You haven't done anything for him? Valerie gasped. We kiss! He's such a wonderful kisser. I let him touch me. I helped him out a little the night before the game, she said, trying to explain. You've never done more than that? Heather asked softly. Crystal shook her head, her big blue eyes wide. Heather made a circle with her fingers to show how thick he was. The redhead rolled her eyes and adjusted her fingers to fit Greg's size better. Heather looked at her curiously. That's a nice size. Maybe a bit wider than Tim, but it's not too big to handle. We can manage. Valerie reached out to grab Heather's hand, surprised. Wow! Pete's not even close to that size. Want to switch boyfriends? I'm really small, okay? Crystal replied firmly. I've checked. I even bought a special toy. What? Where did you get that? They don't sell those in town, Heather exclaimed, then blushed at her own curiosity. I ordered it online from a trusted site. They delivered it in a plain package, Crystal explained. Heather blinked in shock. Weren't you worried someone would open it like your mom or even your dad? Crystal shook her head. Dad is too busy to notice mail that isn't for him. She paused, then added, Mom's ordered things like that too because Dad is always working. More giggles followed. Finally, her friend's earlier words sunk in. Wait, you two seem to know a lot about your boyfriends. You've been with him. They smiled, and a wave of jealousy washed over the redhead. Maybe if you stopped calling it that, you'd worry less about it, Heather suggested, trying to lighten the mood. She noticed the anger rising and quickly added, "But I'm really envious of the attention Greg gives you. Tim doesn't spend much time making me feel good at all." Valerie jumped in with her thoughts. "Pete doesn't do much in that area either. I wish I could experience what Greg does for you, even just once." They had managed to shift her anger, but sadness took its place. "I have to end things with him, but I feel so attached to the happiness he brings me." Heather chuckled, but saw her friend was serious. "How often do you even see each other?" 2 or 3 times a week, Crystal sighed. "Wow!" Valerie exclaimed, her mind racing with the idea. Heather was trying to think through it all. "How do you find the time with everything else you have going on?" Crystal smirked playfully. "We usually get together at his house after school since his mom is at work. He enjoys it a lot," she added with a cheeky smile. "We even found a moment in a supply closet at school. That was a quick but thrilling experience." "And all this time you didn't think about returning the favor? Is he really just that easygoing?" Heather wondered aloud. Crystal threw a pillow at her playfully. Heather frowned. "Come on. You have to admit your relationship feels unfair." Crystal returned to her pout. "I know, all right. It's just, he's a lot to handle," she grumbled. "Then you should let him go as gently as you can. It's going to hurt him and make him upset. But the longer you stay, the harder it's going to be for both of you," Heather said softly. Crystal glared, but knew what Heather said was true and nodded. Still, the timing was awful. Greg leaned back against his pillow, watching the clouds drift past his window. He felt a lot of his current peace and comfort came from the medicine he was taking. The concussion was finally getting better, and he only had to deal with his broken leg now. He heard a noise and turned to see his mom entering his room. The second bed was empty, so they had some privacy. Seeing her smile made him smile in return. "Hi, Mom." Her smile grew wider, lighting up her eyes. He loved seeing her happy. "Good morning, sweetie. How are you feeling today?" she asked. "I'm feeling pretty good, if you know what I mean," he replied with a grin. Her smile turned into a playful smirk. "Should I ask the doctor to lower your medicine?" "Please don't. I think it's too soon for that. I can still feel some pain behind the good feelings from the medicine. I'm thankful for it right now," he said, wincing slightly as if to prove his point. Her face showed worry again when she noticed him flinch a little. "Is there anything I can do for you?" she asked, holding his hand gently. He smiled back at her to reassure her. "Not right now. I think the doctors are managing. Have you heard from Dad?" She nodded, a smile returning to her face. "He called last night and wishes you a quick recovery." "How did his meeting go?" Greg asked, closing his eyes to ease the pain in his head. When he felt warmth on his forehead, he opened his eyes and saw his mom pulling back. "It went well, but talks are still ongoing. I can see you're still hurting from your concussion, so I'm heading to work now. I will check on you later, okay?" He nodded and smiled, feeling himself start to drift off again. It seemed he still had a long way to go in recovering from his concussion. Greg turned his gaze to the window to watch the clouds go by, but soon drifted off to sleep before he could see them moving. Candace did her rounds and timed her visit to Greg's room for when the nurses were busy with other patients. She hid her cart behind a spare bed. When the hallway was clear, she quietly entered his room and listened. The only sound was Greg's calm breathing as he rested. She tiptoed closer and looked down at his peaceful face. He seemed so relaxed and innocent. But deep down, he wasn't innocent. He had experiences with Crystal that Candace yearned for herself. It felt unfair. She had never had a boyfriend. She had never been kissed. She had never felt a man's touch. Candace longed for those things, and it seemed like Crystal was wasting them. Last night, before she could take her listening device away from Crystal's room, she overheard her sister and her friends giggling behind a closed door. Unable to help herself, she listened in and heard her sister's confessions. Candace bit her lip as she imagined Greg being close, his hands in her hair, his warmth beside her. Then she remembered when he accidentally bumped into her in the hall. She sighed softly, and Greg slowly opened his eyes. She froze. "Candace?" he said quietly, his voice heavy with sleep. She panicked slightly, knowing she was taking a risk. He seemed curious and not alarmed to see her there. "Is Crystal here?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Her heart ached for him. After hearing Crystal with her friends last night, she knew what Greg might expect. Unless Crystal gave in to her own wants again. Candace wasn't sure how that would turn out. She realized how much her little sister had changed. Even though she didn't know Greg very well, she could tell from their few conversations that he was a kind person who didn't deserve to be treated badly. "Is everything all right? You look sad," he said. His voice brought her back to reality, and she put on a forced smile. His gaze drifted to the door, as if waiting for Crystal to come in. It was hard for her to watch, so she quickly turned away and stepped out of the room. She grabbed her cart and moved on. One thought kept repeating in her mind. It wasn't fair. On Monday afternoon after school, Tim and Heather visited Greg and found him awake. "Hey, buddy. Sorry we didn't come by yesterday. The doctor said you needed some rest. How are you feeling?" Tim asked, shaking Greg's hand. "My head doesn't hurt as much when I think," Greg answered. "Wow, you're getting better," Tim joked. "You're a jerk." Greg laughed back. Heather smiled at their joking and leaned in to quickly kiss Greg on the cheek. She couldn't help but think about what Crystal had told her. "Thanks, but what was that for?" Greg asked, surprised since she had never done that before. She blushed. "You just scared us all," she replied, feeling embarrassed. Tim chuckled. "Oh, I see what you're doing, Greg. You hurt yourself on purpose to take all our girlfriends with this act." Greg laughed, happy to see his friends. While he had needed some quiet time, he felt a bit lonely. His mom had visited for a few hours on Sunday, and Candace had popped in a few times to check on him. He missed his friends and was thankful Tim was there. The tall blonde gave Greg a mock bow. "On behalf of the team, I want to thank you for bringing us together. We worked as a team and crushed our opponents 473 to win the state championship." Greg raised an eyebrow. "You actually managed to throw to Butterfingers, Ron?" Tim laughed. "Ron was so inspired by you that he caught everything I threw. His new nickname is Peanut Butterfingers because he caught every pass." Greg's stomach rumbled. "Now I want some peanut butter." Tim's smile faded. "I left the donuts I got for you in my truck. Hang on a sec." Heather stayed behind as Tim rushed out. After a brief moment of silence, she suddenly sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the sheets tight across Greg's lap. She glanced down and realized she should not have looked. "Oh, I'm sorry," she blurted out, as Greg quickly adjusted the sheets. After seeing the evidence, her mind flashed back to the earlier conversation. "Crystal said you were too big," she whispered, feeling flustered. Greg was surprised that Crystal would talk about their personal time. Then he froze, realizing what she meant by too big. His eyes met Heather's. As she tried to calm down, Heather's words spilled out. "But she thinks highly of your skills." Greg's face turned red with embarrassment and annoyance. Just then, Tim burst into the room, slightly out of breath, holding a box of donuts. His smile vanished when he noticed Greg's anger and the worried look on Heather's face. "What's going on?" Heather didn't trust her words anymore, so she just shook her head, looking sad. "Crystal has been too open about our private moments. That needs to change if she wants to stay my girlfriend," Greg said firmly. Heather lowered her head, trying to hide her feelings, but both Greg and Tim knew something was wrong. Tim placed the donut box on the small table beside the bed and gently lifted Heather's chin to meet her gaze. "I think it's time for the truth." Heather glanced at Greg and then back at Tim. "He'll find out later today when Crystal comes. It's not my place to say. I've already made things complicated. Crystal will tell him." Great. She's going to end things with me, Greg thought, confused because everything seemed fine between them. He couldn't help but wonder, "Is it because she thinks I'm too big?" he whispered. Once again, her face confirmed his worry. He looked at Heather, anger building. "Why did she keep leading me on? She used me and left me frustrated. I was patient." Heather flinched at his outburst and glanced at Tim for support, but Tim's sympathy was clearly with Greg. Nurse Stewart entered the room, frowning. "What's going on? No shouting allowed in the hospital." Heather stood near Tim, looking sorrowful. The head nurse saw the distress on Greg's face. "It seems visiting hours for your friends are over for today, Mr. Hughes." "That's fine with me. I only want to see my mom anyway, he replied, forcing out words about Crystal. The nurse nodded in understanding. Greg looked at Tim, who nodded back, and he turned to stare out the window, ignoring Heather. Nurse Stewart motioned for the couple to leave the room, and they did, with her following close behind. She informed the other nurses about the visiting restrictions for Greg, and the ward returned to its quiet routine. Crystal arrived in the ward 10 minutes before visiting hours were over. She had spent hours choosing the right words to gently let Greg down. She had practiced her story so much that it felt real to her. She imagined many ways he might respond. In her favorite scenario, Greg would kindly ask to stay friends, but with some extra closeness. As she walked down the hall, she realized she didn't even know what room he was in. She stopped at the nurse's station where two women were talking behind the desk. "Excuse me, could you tell me which room Greg Hughes is in?" she asked. The older woman looked at her with recognition. One of the perks of being a Tafferty, she thought. The woman came to the counter, but she didn't look friendly. Her body seemed tense. "Mr. Hughes is not seeing anyone today." Crystal felt a wave of surprise. "What? Is he okay?" she asked, worried he was having problems from his recent injury. The senior nurse softened a bit. "No, he is recovering well. He had a visitor earlier who left him upset, and he requested no more visitors except for his mother." "But I'm his!" "And especially not you. I'm sorry, Miss Tafferty." Crystal stepped back in shock. Was he upset with her? Wait, someone had come to see him and made him angry? "Who were his last visitors?" she asked quietly. The nurse shook her head. "I didn't catch their names. They seemed to be his friends, a tall blonde man and his blonde girlfriend." "Heather, how could she do this?" Crystal turned and dashed out of the hospital. Tears blurred her vision as she rushed past a woman entering. She squeaked and quickly moved aside, hurrying to her car. Nurse Stewart noticed someone rushing to the station. It was Mrs. Hughes, and she looked worried. "Greg? He's fine. Resting well and healing nicely," the head nurse reassured her. Relief washed over her, but then confusion. She pointed toward the entrance. "Miss Tafferty just found out your son doesn't want to see her," the nurse added with a shrug. "Oh?" Mrs. Hughes glanced back at the door, then turned to the nurse. "Thank you," she said, moving quickly toward Greg's room. When she entered, she saw him staring out the window, gripping a tissue in his hand. "Greg? Honey?" she called gently. When he turned to face her, she noticed his eyes were red from crying. "Hi, Mom," he murmured. "What happened? I saw Crystal leave the hospital in tears." She watched feelings of anger and sadness flash across his face. Greg seemed to struggle to find words. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "I feel so foolish. All this time she was just using me." "What? Crystal? You two looked so happy together." Mrs. Hughes went to his bedside and gently ran her fingers through his hair. Greg struggling to hold back tears. He tried to clear his throat and spoke again. I thought it was love, but she never did." That's all Greg could say before the pain in his heart took over again. His body shook as silent tears started flowing once more. His mother stood beside him, her hand gently touching his cheek as he leaned into her warm presence. Candace was in the hall just outside Greg's room. Tears streamed down her face, too. She had heard Greg's words, and it broke her heart. She was furious with her sister for causing him pain. Greg had treated Crystal well. He had cared for her, while Crystal had taken advantage of him and left him feeling worthless. Candace wanted to rush into the room to comfort him, but she knew he wouldn't want to see her now. "Candace? Please come away from there, that's private," Nurse Stewart said quietly, startling her. "I'm sorry," Candace quickly replied, and followed the nurse back to the nurse's station. Her emotions were all over the place. She usually kept them under control, but thinking of Greg made her feel shaky. Suddenly, she reached out and touched the nurse's arm. The woman paused and looked at her. "What is it, dear?" Candace's thoughts were a jumble. She didn't know what to say, but felt the need to express something. "Greg is so sad," she blurted out, feeling a bit foolish as tears continued to fall. Margaret's face softened, and she wrapped her arms around Candace. "Broken hearts are tough, but usually get better. He has friends and his mother who will help him. He'll be okay. In time." The nurse released Candace and gave her a warm smile before heading back to her duties. Candace stood in the hall and realized being there wasn't helping. It was time to go home. Crystal took another gulp of her father's whiskey, wincing as it burned her throat. When she finished, she noticed the bottle was empty. It had been half full when she started. As she tried to put it back on the bar, she missed and dropped it. To her relief, the bottle bounced and rolled away instead of breaking, and she felt a little unsteady on her feet as the room spun around her. She grabbed the back of her father's chair to steady herself. She felt furious with Greg for what had happened at the hospital. Why couldn't he have listened to her? She would have ended things without all the drama, and they could have parted as friends. Maybe he would have still wanted to be close to her in some way. Crystal felt a strange mix of emotions as anger surged through her. She knew she had hurt him, and that realization stung. She felt a deep sense of regret, but she believed she could have eased his pain if only she had spoken to him before Heather told him everything. Crystal turned back to the bar, grabbed another bottle, and poured herself a drink. She slammed the bottle down and stared at it to make sure it stayed there. Then she knocked back the shot. It went down, but the burning sensation was worse than she expected. She coughed and let go of her glass as she stumbled back from the bar. She bumped into the arm of a chair and fell against it. She tried to turn, but the arm hit her hard. Pain shot through her and she felt sick, spilling her drink onto the carpet beside the chair. Her head spun so much that she fainted right there. Byron was in a bad mood when he got home. He had to fire one of the accountants after catching him snooping where he shouldn't have been. The new accounts Byron set up to move money from the pension fund and the corporate accounts were ready to go. That rude employee, Taylor, almost found the entries in the logs before Byron could erase them. Security quickly took the confused man out of the building before he could check the logs. Taylor had some warnings on his record, so his swift exit wouldn't cause Byron too many problems. All he needed was 2 days to create a nice savings for himself at his private estate in French Polynesia. He stood in the large entrance of his mansion and looked at the old portraits of his ancestors. Their stern faces seemed to watch over him, judging him. Forget them. The Tafferty legacy ended with him. His son was a drunken fool with neither the ambition nor the smarts to carry on the family business. Candace had caused the loss of the woman he loved, and Crystal was just another self-centered person. After Ellie passed away, everything changed for Byron. All his plans and dreams for the future lost their meaning. She had been the only bright spot in his life. With her gone, his life felt like it had come to a standstill, and he took a moment to think about it. Before that day, he had followed the steps of his ancestors. He had put his time and energy into growing the family business and helping the community. He didn't enjoy it, but he understood his duties and did them. His father had made sure he learned that lesson well. But with the loss of the woman he wished to grow old with, his role in the company and the community felt hollow. Instead, he planned a new path that put his own wants above his responsibilities to the business, the community, and even to his family. He had married Missy to have someone pretty by his side at the social events he was expected to attend. She wasn't the best companion, but he soon lost interest in her because they didn't connect. He gave her a child to keep her busy, even though he didn't want another baby since he already had 2 kids, and it was Ellie who had wanted them. For 20 years, he had been working on his plan. It was carefully thought out and almost complete. He was just days away from accessing the employee pension funds, which were finally ready to be moved. He planned to transfer the money into his personal bank account abroad. At the same time, he would move the company's cash into another offshore account. Then he could escape to a tropical paradise and leave behind the business, the dull town, and the family members he found burdensome. He sighed deeply. Soon. For now, he just wanted to relax and have a drink for a little while. As he walked into his study, a terrible smell hit him. He noticed an empty scotch bottle on the floor, and his son's name came to mind, filling him with anger as he stepped into the room. His emotions shifted when he saw Crystal sprawled out on his chair looking very disheveled. She reeked of alcohol, and there was a mess on the carpet. Byron was fed up with her spoiled behavior. He lifted her skirt and tugged at her underwear. The sound of skin hitting skin jolted the drunken girl awake. A second and third slap brought her more to her senses. she shouted. Her scream only fueled Byron's anger, and he struck her harder, randomly hitting each side. "Daddy! Please! Ah!" Crystal yelled, distressed. Her screams caught the attention of Missy, who rushed into the study wearing her robe and slippers. She hurried to Byron's side and grabbed his arm. "Byron! What are you doing?" she yelled in shock. He pulled his arm away from her grip, glaring at her. "I'm doing what should have been done long ago to stop her from being spoiled. You give in to her too much." He slapped Crystal again, making her scream louder, and Missy finally snapped out of her shock and tried to grab his arm again. But instead, he accidentally hit her with his hand. She stumbled backwards, tripped over the empty bottle, and crashed into the liquor cart, hitting her head. She fell to the ground, and some things shattered, cutting her arm in the process. "God damn it! Look at the mess you've made!" Byron shouted at Missy. Candace stood just outside the study, holding her phone close to her ear. She heard it ring, and then someone picked up. 911, what's your emergency? Candace took a steadying breath to stay in character. "Daddy is hurting Missy and Crystal. He knocked Missy down, and she's bleeding. I think they're hurt." "Who's speaking?" asked the operator. "Candy Tafferty," Candace replied, catching the operator sighing at the call. "All right, Candy, I'm sending ambulances and a police car to your address, okay? Stay on the line." "Candy, are you snooping?" Cal's voice came from behind her. He grabbed the phone out of her hand and pushed her back against the wall. Her head throbbed from the impact. He glanced into the study, noticing Missy lying still on the floor with blood on her clothes. "Is that blood?" The 911 operator's voice was still on the line. "Sir? Who am I speaking to?" Cal finally looked at the phone in irritation and hung up. He dragged Candace into the study and tossed her phone onto the couch. As she fell onto the cushions, she quickly grabbed the phone and hid it under her waistband. She glanced up at Cal, who was distracted, assessing Crystal's injuries. "She's got some cuts," Cal remarked. "What were you using on her?" Byron looked down, noticing blood on his ring. Outside, flashing red and blue lights signaled the arrival of the police and ambulance. Byron scowled. "Why are they here?" he barked at Cal. Cal raised his hands defensively. "It was Candy!" A loud knock came at the front door. Cal simply stared, smirking at his father. "Go tell them to leave," Byron ordered. Cal huffed, irritated. "That's a cop. He won't just listen to me." "Get to the door! Be useful for once!" Byron shouted. Cal threw Byron a defiant look and left. Candace quickly moved to check on Missy, noticing a deep cut on her arm. She found a cloth napkin from a nearby cart and tied it tightly around Missy's wound to stop the bleeding. Suddenly she felt a blow to her head and everything spun. Byron was dragging her away from Missy, gripping her hair tightly. The pain made her cry out. "Are you pretending?" he hissed, glaring down at her. Candace stared up, her wide eyes filled with real fear. He looked like he might hurt her again, and her head was still spinning from his hit. She needed him to fall for her trick. "You're hurting me!" she cried in a small voice. Then his gaze shifted from doubt to disgust as he bought into her act once more. He let go of her hair with another tug and turned to see a police officer standing in the hallway with a worried look on his face. The officer stepped inside to make room for the paramedics who were coming in. Two of them arrived right away. One went to Missy and the other quickly moved to Crystal. Candace knew she had to leave the house tonight. If the paramedics were taking her stepmom and sister to the hospital, that would be the safest place for her, too. The police wouldn't keep her safe. She silently slipped away while the officer talked quietly to Byron. She hurried up the stairs to her bedroom and changed her clothes, right down to her undergarments. Her head still hurt from his hit, and she wondered if she had a concussion. She grabbed her little Hello Kitty purse, swung it across her body, and went back downstairs. Hearing Byron and Cal arguing loudly, she quickly ran outside and climbed into the back of the ambulance with Missy strapped to a gurney. The paramedic closed the back door and noticed her. "No, Candy, you need to stay home." She shook her head and winced. The man frowned and climbed in. He quickly checked the bruising on the side of her face and looked at her pupils. His expression changed as he realized what had happened. "Looks like he hurt you too," the man said. He turned and closed the doors. "Let's go," he called to the driver, and they set off. Another ambulance followed, but the police car stayed at the house. On the way to the hospital, the paramedic glanced at Candace, who was leaning against the wall, looking tired. "Did you put the napkin on this woman's injury?" he asked. She nodded, careful not to move too much. "You did a good job. You may have helped her a lot," he said, and Candace gave him a weak smile. Soon they arrived at the hospital, and Candace's headache got worse. She had trouble keeping her eyes open. They checked her in along with Crystal and Missy, but since her injury wasn't as urgent, they put her in a waiting area. The emergency room was very busy, and the ambulances quickly went back out. Candace heard someone mention a multi-car accident on the nearby highway. She was holding her head in her hands as the pain throbbed when Nurse Stewart came to talk to her. "Candace, dear, why are you still here?" Then she noticed the wristband. "Oh, what happened? Daddy hit me," she managed to say while pointing to the side of her head. "He hurt Crystal and Missy, too." Margaret checked Candace's eyes and frowned. "It seems you might have a concussion, but you'll need to wait for the doctor to confirm." "Back to work already, Margaret?" She smiled at the younger man who walked into the small room to do the same check she had done. "Dr. Markle, why would I want your job when I enjoy my own respect and responsibility?" He laughed and nodded. "I agree with your assessment. There is also a cut on her temple near her hairline." He frowned. "Could it be from a ring?" He looked at Candace. "Who hurt you?" She glanced at the doctor, then at Margaret, who nodded. "Daddy." "Why did he do that?" the doctor asked. "I put a napkin on Missy's cut to stop it from bleeding." The doctor turned to the nurse and she explained, "Missy is Candace's stepmother." But the doctor continued, "How did Missy get hurt?" "My head hurts and I'm really tired," Candace said, feeling bad for making them ask more questions. "We'll get you a bed, but we just need a bit more information," Markle said. Margaret frowned. "It's unlikely anything you hear would be allowed in court. And remember who this is about?" The doctor looked away for a moment. He sighed and then turned back to the nurse. "Get her a room. We'll keep her overnight for observation. I'll see if her stepmother wants to talk." Margaret nodded and told Candace, "Just wait here while I find you a room." Candace closed her eyes, drifting in and out until someone finally put her in a wheelchair and brought her to a new room. The next time she woke up, she was in a hospital gown, resting in bed. A nurse leaned over to speak to her. "We'll check on you several times tonight. This is just to be careful. You're safe now." Candace smiled at her. Safe. If only the nurse knew. As long as her father was free, she wouldn't truly be safe. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Greg opened his eyes and smiled when he heard his mom's voice. His eyes widened fully when he saw both his mom and dad beside his bed. The curtain was drawn and he wasn't alone anymore. "Dad, you're back?" he gasped. The man smiled and took his hand. "Back? I might be a bit tired, but I'm pretty sure I'm in a hospital." Greg's mom rolled her eyes and playfully tapped her husband's arm. "George, don't tease him." She looked at her son. "How does your head feel today?" He smiled at her. "Much better. No pain at all. Does this mean I can come home?" "I think we'll find out this afternoon," his mom said, and he nodded. Greg frowned and looked at his dad. "I thought you'd be away for another 2 weeks." George smiled. "Your mother updated me on how you're doing after the accident, and I thought you could use some help during your first week back home. I'll work remotely in the evenings. Your mom can't take more time off." She made a sound of disagreement. "It's true, Marion. We made great progress on the project, and now we just need to fine-tune a few details. That should take about a week or 2. We're still ahead of schedule." Greg couldn't stop smiling, and his parents smiled back at him. Then a woman's sobs came from the doorway. Greg's smile faded as the voice sounded familiar. He looked at his mother, whose face showed concern. "Is that Crystal?" he asked softly. Marion nodded. "I overheard some nurses talking while we waited to see you. There was an incident at the Tafferty's house last night. Byron hurt Crystal, and she had surgery. Her mother did too. They're both in the room across the hall. We're not sure what happened to the mother. Candace is in the next room with a head injury." "How could someone hurt a woman who needs help?" Greg reacted angrily. "Many people are wondering the same. The problem is that the man who did this is very powerful and respected in this town." Greg's gaze drifted back to the door and the sound of Crystal crying. He felt strange that he wasn't feeling happy about the situation. I hope I can go home soon. I'm not sure how much of this I can handle. I hate what she did to me, and I'm really upset with her. I wouldn't mind if I never saw her again, but I don't want to hear her in pain. His mother smiled and held his hand. You have a kind heart, Greg. He gets that from me, his dad said with a grin. Marion rolled her eyes at her husband and then looked at her son with excitement. Oh, I heard the nurses calling Candace a hero. She was the one who called for help, and she took care of her stepmother's injury. She saved her life. Greg smiled as he remembered how Candace would cheer him up during her hospital visits. She made the place feel a little less lonely. He wondered if he could do something nice for her when he got the chance. A young nurse appeared behind his parents and caught their attention. Mr. Hughes is scheduled for a sponge bath and then breakfast. That sounds great. Where should I lay down? George said with a playful smile. Come on, George, you're impossible, Marion said, shaking her head at her husband while giving an apologetic look to the confused nurse. Then she turned back to Greg. We'll be here when you're done. I'll check on your release time. I think he's set to go home just before lunch, if the doctor can complete his final check and sign the papers, the nurse added. That's wonderful. Thank you, Greg's mom said as she gently nudged her husband toward the door. The nurse smiled at Greg, who was shaking his head at his dad's playful behavior. It's nice that your parents came to see you. Greg's smile grew bigger. Dad flew back from Germany, he exclaimed, then quickly felt a bit silly for being so excited. He looked up at the nurse and saw her grinning at him. She seemed impressed and started getting things ready for his sponge bath. I guess he must really care about you, she teased. Greg chuckled, unable to hide his smile. He noticed the nurse looked pleased with his reply. She carefully and skillfully helped him clean up, making it feel like a simple task. Greg's mind wandered, thinking about why hospital food always tasted so plain, as if they wanted patients to leave quickly. Really, Mr. Hughes, the nurse quietly chided as she paused for a moment. He snapped back to reality, noticing the look on her face. What? She pressed her lips together and tilted her head to make him look down. He did, and his eyes widened when he realized what she was hinting at. Sorry, what's wrong? Her expression tightened. I take pride in my work and aim to make patients comfortable. Yet it seems you're not as relaxed as I expected, she whispered. What? No, I'm not, he insisted, trying to dismiss her concern. She looked him straight in the eyes. There's no need to lie. I can see feeling a bit embarrassed. Greg adjusted himself and tried to explain. It's nothing serious. Her cheeks turned red. My apologies, I thought. I mean, I haven't seen anything like this before. And now you have. Can we just finish up? He asked, his own cheeks feeling warm. She returned to her task, but her touches seemed different now. Greg felt his heart race as he tried to focus on something else. Excuse me, are you almost done? He asked softly. Sorry, she said, but her attention seemed to linger a bit longer. After she finished, Greg felt flustered. He looked out the window, trying to calm himself, but every gentle touch reminded him of the earlier moments. The nurse gently closed his hospital gown and made sure everything was tucked in. Greg suppressed a sound as he caught her smiling at him before she turned to leave. Another nurse will bring you breakfast shortly, she said cheerfully. Have a nice day. Greg adjusted his blankets to cover up before the next nurse came in. He noticed her slight frown as she set his table next to him. Too bad. Do you want me to adjust the bed? She asked, but he shook his head. Thanks, I can manage, he said softly as she left the room. After he took a bite of his food, he finally got the answer he had been thinking about earlier. Ugh. He couldn't leave soon enough. It was noon when his parents finally came to get him. The doctor had come and gone, and it seemed his mom had completed all the paperwork because she walked into his room carrying some clothes. Since the lower part of his left leg was in a cast, she had to cut the leg off his favorite track pants. He wasn't too happy about that. An orderly came in next with crutches and handed them to George. The man then lowered Greg's leg from the support that was keeping it raised. He pulled a curtain around them and helped Greg get dressed. He took back the crutches from Greg's dad, adjusted them for Greg, and explained how to use them. Once Greg understood, the orderly helped him into a wheelchair and handed the crutches back to George, who passed them to Marion as he planned to push the chair. He positioned himself behind it, and they left the room. When they reached the hallway, Greg stopped them. He glanced at the door across from them, but Crystal was quiet now. They must have given her something. Then he turned to his mom. "Can we check on Candace? I want to thank her for visiting." "Of course, sweetie," Marion said with a warm smile and led them to the next room. "Just give me a second," she said as she went inside. A moment later, she came back and waved for them to go in. As Greg was wheeled into the room, he saw Candace for the first time. She was using her pretty pink hair to cover her facial scars, trying to smooth it down with her fingers. He looked into her blue eye and noticed she seemed a bit anxious. He wanted to keep this brief. "Hi, Candace. I just wanted to thank you for visiting me. You really helped me feel better," Greg said. She nodded, glancing at his parents. "This is my mom and my dad, Marion and George," he introduced them. Candace nodded to them with a slight smile. "Dear, we'll just be outside when you're finished. It was nice to meet you again, Candace," Marion said as she smiled at the girl and guided her confused husband out of the room. Greg watched them leave, feeling just as confused as his dad. He had said what he meant to say. Turning back to Candace, he saw her smile grow a bit more as she seemed to find his confusion amusing. He searched for something else to say and recalled something his mother told him earlier. "I heard about what you did last night. I'm really impressed that you called for help and made sure your stepmom was okay. I'm really sorry you got hurt." "Thank you," she replied, and he nodded. "I'm also sorry that Crystal and your stepmom got hurt. That's terrible." He paused to gather his thoughts. "I don't really like Crystal right now, but I'd never want anything bad to happen to her." He felt his heart ache a little more as he spoke. He sighed and looked up to see two beautiful blue eyes watching him closely. She had pulled her hair back, and he had never seen her like this before. His heart skipped a beat as he admired her beauty. He looked down and swallowed hard, realizing how hurt he still felt after Crystal's betrayal. "You're not her boyfriend?" Candace asked carefully. He looked into her eyes again, surprised, and shook his head. "No, not anymore. I don't have a girlfriend." "You could be mine," she said suddenly. Greg was so surprised he almost laughed, but stopped himself when he saw the hope in her eyes. Instead, he smiled at her. "I've just been turned down by your sister. My heart still hurts from that. Just like I need time for my leg to heal, I need time for my heart to heal too. Besides, I'd never want anyone to think I'm dating you just to get back at her. You deserve better than that." "You wouldn't do that," she insisted. He couldn't help but chuckle at how sincerely she defended him. "Thank you. You're right, I wouldn't." He sighed as he admired her lovely features. "Unfortunately, I don't think the adults would let us be boyfriend and girlfriend." He gave her a sad look, then glanced quickly at the doorway. "We can talk about this another time once I have healed from both my injuries. I should go back to my parents now. My dad flew in from Germany to help me. He must be tired. Thanks again for checking on me. It really meant a lot." Candace nodded at him. Greg thought she looked a bit sad but also frustrated, and he wondered why. He tried to move the wheelchair backward but got stuck. Looking back at Candace, feeling embarrassed, he noticed she was giving him a strange look. She seemed different for a moment. Confused, he looked over his shoulder into the hallway. "Dad?" His dad entered the room and helped him out of the stuck position. They waved at Candace, and George wheeled Greg out into the hall. His mom came forward and met his gaze. "Would you like to see how Crystal and her mom are doing?" He shook his head. "Neither of us is ready to talk. Let's go home. Dad must be tired, and I'm really hungry for real food." Marion chuckled and brushed his hair back. She then turned to her husband. "Let's go home, dear," George smiled. "Of course, honey." Greg made a face. "Ew, pet names. I did not need to hear that." His parents laughed as they wheeled their son out of the hospital. Candace leaned back against her pillow, shaking a little at how close she'd come to ruining 2 years of effort. Her feelings for Greg surprised her. There was no doubt she was attracted to him, so much so that she had tried to get him to be her boyfriend. She rubbed her face with her hands. She felt the scar on her face and remembered how Greg looked at her, noticing her bare face. He didn't seem disgusted or uncomfortable. There was no pity in his gaze. What she saw could have been her own wishful thinking. She saw longing and a kind of sadness mixed in with it. He was right. It was too soon after his breakup with Crystal. Then he mentioned that the adults didn't want them to be together. That's when she understood how big her mistake was. In wanting him, she had lost herself. She was acting like a child, almost forgetting who she really was. There was no way he could be with her, not the way she hoped, not until she was ready to tell him the truth. And then? Would Greg understand? Would he be able to forgive her? Could he care for her? Would anyone? She felt tears on her cheeks and realized she was crying. Her sobs broke free from her tight chest. The room blurred through her tears and she struggled to breathe. It felt like she was suffocating. Easy now, just breathe. Warm arms wrapped around her, pulling her close to a soft chest. The fabric felt stiff, like a uniform, and slowly her panic began to pass. She felt herself being rocked gently while someone whispered soothing words, cutting through her chaos. You'll be okay. Everything will be all right. That voice finally registered in her mind. It was Margaret Stewart. She held on to her tightly and tried to calm her racing heart as her sobs continued. She felt so alone. She had been for a long time. When these kind people found out about her lies, they would hate her, and she would be all alone again. Just thinking about it hurt so much. She had grown to cherish their kindness and needed it more than ever. Candace, dear, slow your breathing. Take it easy, just like this. Good girl. Margaret gently rubbed her back and held her close. Her voice was calming, and Candace felt her fear start to fade. Soon she could breathe more calmly, following Margaret's instructions, taking deep breaths as the tension began to lift. Once her breathing returned to normal and the shaking began to ease, Margaret leaned back to look at her. Brown eyes met blue and she smiled. Feeling better now? Candace nodded, still too shaky to speak. Can you share why you were crying? What troubled you? The nurse asked softly. It took her a few tries, her lips quivering too much to form words, but she managed to get one word out. It was the truth. Lonely. Margaret's eyes showed understanding and compassion for her. You're having a tough time at home, aren't you? Candace nodded slowly, gasping a few times as her chest felt tight again. Shh, it's okay. Just breathe slowly, Margaret said gently. Candace followed her advice, closing her eyes and focusing on her breath until she felt calmer. Shivers ran through her body as the tension began to fade. I'll see if we can keep you here another night. Since your father isn't home, I think it's best for you not to be alone tonight, Margaret told her. Candace looked at Margaret confused. Where is he? She asked. Margaret sighed with frustration. He should be in jail for what he did to you three, but the sheriff took him to his lawyer's office instead. They've been in there together for a while. She looked into Candace's eyes and saw she was calming down. Let me find out what I can do. Candace took Margaret's hand. Thank you. Margaret watched her for a moment to make sure she would be okay, then nodded and left the room. Candace's mind was spinning with the news that her father was still out there after hurting them. It didn't surprise her, but the unfairness of it took her breath away. She knew her father's plan to leave his family, his job, and the town, and she even knew when it was supposed to happen. Months ago, she'd accessed his computer looking for something she could use against him. She uncovered his messages and learned about his scheme. He planned to take money from the employee pension fund during its transfer to a new plan. The change in account numbers had been hidden from everyone but her. This change happened just 2 days ago. Candace had created an online archive to keep every email and text related to her father's scheme. She even recorded calls from his office phone concerning it. Taking a big risk, she had sneaked into his home office and copied important documents. That was when she found out about the offshore accounts. Knowing the account numbers and access codes allowed her to interfere with his plan. Candace added every document she could find that linked the sheriff and her father's lawyer to the scheme. They were helping him for a share of the money. The last piece of evidence she collected was hospital records, proving her father had the police lower Cal's blood alcohol level from an accident that left her with a scar. Today, her biggest worry was that her father might hurt her or stop her from telling the truth before she could reveal his wrongdoings. He was becoming more unpredictable as the deadline approached. If he found out what she was doing, she wouldn't be safe anywhere in the county. Even though Cal was also being let go by their father, Candace couldn't depend on him for help. He was just as harsh as his father, but he lacked the cleverness that his father had. She was all by herself. Her father's plan was about to go into action, and he had just lost his temper, almost ruining everything. Candace figured that the sheriff and the lawyer were keeping him away to protect their share of what was coming. Candace knew she didn't have much time to set her plan in motion. She realized she couldn't do it from the hospital. She had to go back home to her bedroom to get her laptop. She would have taken it with her if she hadn't been so confused. After getting her laptop, she needed a safe place to hide from her father and the sheriff. She would figure that out later. She sat up. Her head hurt, but not as much as it had the night before. She needed to get dressed and leave before the nurses came back. Standing up felt like a big win. She found her clothes from the night before in the closet. She got dressed quickly but tucked her hair into her blouse to hide its color. Once she was by the door, she waited for a break in the sounds outside, then slipped out and hurried to the stairwell, making her way down to the first floor. It was easy to leave the hospital without being seen. Getting home would be more difficult. Then she remembered the old man who lived a block from the hospital. He repaired old bicycles in his garage and sold them. She walked in that direction and saw him rolling his bikes onto the driveway. She noticed a pink bicycle with white streamers on the handlebars and smiled. It wouldn't look out of place for her at all. "Hello, Candy," he called out with a big smile. She looked closer and realized he was one of the patients she'd met in the hospital. "Mr. Nash, it's good to see you." The old man was glad she remembered his name. "Please call me Bert. I'm feeling much better. It's nice to see you." Then he noticed the bruises on her face. "Oh my, what happened?" She considered saying she fell to avoid a long explanation, but she didn't want to lie. "Daddy hit me." His eyes went wide. "Why did he do that?" Candace took a deep breath as the memories tightened her chest. "He hurt Missy and Crystal. I was trying to help Missy." Bert hugged her tightly, and she held on until she felt calmer. He let her go and smiled. "You're not too hurt? Should you be in the hospital?" She shook her head gently, wincing at the movement. "I'm okay." Candace pointed at the pink bicycle lined up with the others. "I'd like to buy that one." He looked at the pink bike and grinned. "It seems just right for you," he teased. She smiled and nodded in agreement. "Here's what I'm going to do. Because you were so understanding and listened to my complaints, I want you to have this for free," he said with a smile as he moved the bicycle closer. Candace looked surprised. "I can pay." "No, I really want you to have it. Please," Bert said kindly. After looking into his eyes, she nodded. She gave him another hug. "Thank you." Bert's face turned a bit red from the hug, but he remained polite. "You're welcome," he replied. She admired the bicycle, which had wide tires, an upright seating position with handlebars that curved back, and a frame that was easy to get on and off. It has 7 speeds you control by turning the right side grip. The first gear is for going up hills, and the 7th is for speeding along flat roads. These are the hand brakes. The right side is for the back brake, and the left side is for the front brake. Use the right one more often. Wait a moment. I think I have a helmet that will fit you. Bert went into his garage while Candace got used to the bicycle's controls. She raised the seat a bit to make it more comfortable. "It's not pink, but yellow is nice too," Bert said, as he came back with a bright yellow helmet. He placed it on her head, and she leaned forward so he could adjust the straps. He stepped back and smiled at her. "You look great," he said. She felt a bit shy. She didn't think she looked that way, but she appreciated his kind words. "Thank you, and thank you for the bicycle." He nodded, and she hopped on the cruiser and rode down his driveway to the sidewalk. She had ridden bikes when she was younger, but it had been a long time, so she felt a bit wobbly at first. However, as the saying goes, she quickly got the hang of it. The wide, soft seat was comfortable, which helped. She couldn't pedal too hard because her heartbeat would speed up and make her head hurt. Candace rode through the neighborhood that led back to her home, keeping an eye out for her father's car or a police car. The most nerve-wracking part was the long stretch through the wooded area filled with large houses. Fortunately, she didn't see anyone as she finally reached her driveway. As she rode toward the house, she noticed her brother's car parked out front. She went around to the side of the house and leaned her bike against the wall. She placed the helmet on the seat and quietly moved to the back. Looking through the windows, she didn't see Cal, so she unlocked the back door and let herself in. She listened closely, but the house was quiet. She tiptoed up the stairs to the second floor and carefully passed Cal's closed door to enter her bedroom. She packed a backpack with her computer, chargers, and the journals she had kept hidden. Then she packed some clothes into her bag. She didn't notice Cal's quiet footsteps on the carpet and was taken by surprise when he pushed her hard from behind. She toppled over the mattress of her bed, hitting the wall and slipping into the narrow space between the bed and the wall. She winced from the pain in her back and shoulder. One leg was still on the bed, but she was sliding down into the tight gap. Cal grunted as he pulled on the bedpost, moving the bed further from the wall and making her slide even more. As she tried to get back onto the bed, Candace's hand landed on something. It felt smooth, and when she looked, she realized it was a dumbbell she'd dropped there a week ago. Rough hands grabbed her ankle, pulling her back onto the bed while she twisted to get on her back. "You messed everything up!" Cal shouted, his words slurred as he tugged her further onto the mattress. Her hands were above her head, hidden from him, but the smell of alcohol on his breath made her feel sick. He moved to sit on her when she swung the 5-pound weight at his nose with all her strength. He cried out and fell backward off the bed, landing on the floor. Candace quickly got to her feet and kicked him as hard as she could. He yelled and curled up on his side. She dropped the weight, grabbed her backpack, and stuffed in a few more items. Then she looked down at him. "You are a terrible brother, and you will always be a loser." He stared at her in shock, his expression showing he was hurt. Candace turned and left the room as he tried to say something, but it only came out as a groan. Once outside, she hopped on her bike, adjusting her helmet before pedaling quickly away. She figured out the gears and sped up. She needed to get away from this neighborhood. Just before she reached the end of their street, she heard Cal's loud yell from behind her. "I'll get you!" She glanced back and saw him stumble into his car, starting the engine. Panic rushed through her as she pedaled harder. There wasn't much cover as she rode out of the neighborhood. The road twisted through large, well-kept homes with big lawns, tennis courts, and swimming pools. Most pools were closed for winter, but the Gordon family's tennis court had a heated dome, and their pool was indoors. Candace pedaled as fast as she could, but she could hear the loud roar of Cal's car getting closer. She knew she had to leave the road. It was too open here. Candace frantically searched for a way off the road when a Mustang sped out of the driveway, its tires squealing as it raced ahead, swerving wildly from side to side. Feeling Cal closing in on her, she turned quickly onto the front lawn of the Gordons' property, which had a series of flower beds along the road. The low stone walls prevented Cal from following, but he raced alongside her, yelling from his window. She couldn't hear him over the loud engine. His car hit the curb and he jerked the wheel, trying to regain control as he slammed on the brakes. She sped ahead, but the sound of his engine told her he was still gaining on her. She realized she would soon lose the shelter of the gardens as the lawn spread out in front of her, so she pedaled faster and went deeper into the property. Ahead was a small creek with a bridge, and beyond it, she could see the glassed-in pool at the top of a small hill. She pushed hard toward the bridge. The Mustang roared as Cal drove over the curb, chasing his sister across the uneven ground. Candace's bike handled the bumps better, while the car bounced and swerved. Cal struggled to keep it steady, being thrown around in his seat. This made him press harder on the gas and then ease off, making the car lurch even more. He almost caught up with her bike, but then the front of his car sank into the soft earth, causing it to veer off to the side. Candace felt her heart race as she sensed him close behind her. Then, the bridge was right under her wheels. She turned left to follow a gravel path back toward the road. She heard the Mustang's engine rise sharply as it took off over the creek. Unable to resist, she glanced back just as the car landed and powered up the hill, crashing through the glass wall. Her bike suddenly tipped, and she was thrown over the handlebars and into the bushes along the path. Behind her there were shouts and loud noises. Momentarily dazed, she lay still. Pain throbbed in her head, matching the beat of her pulse. Although she was hurting from the fall, it was the pain in her head that kept her on the ground. When she finally found the strength to sit up and pull herself out of the bushes, she was dirty, scratched, and covered in leaves. She looked back at the pool house and heard glass shatter as more pieces fell from the broken structure. Voices shouted and panicked sounds came from inside the building, but no one seemed to notice her. She carefully picked up her bicycle and walked down the gravel path, limping from her scrapes. When she reached the road, she hopped back on her bike and slowly pedaled away until she left her neighborhood. She sighed in relief that her bicycle was okay. She soon took random turns to explore deeper into the suburban streets, moving away from home toward the other side of town. As she crossed the train tracks on Prentice Street, she remembered something Crystal's friend had said about Greg living this way. She wondered how that girl was managing to get through school. No, she pushed away those negative thoughts and tried to stay positive. Finally, she stopped at a small park and shivered as dark clouds began to gather. Looking up worriedly, she thought it might even snow. That made her think twice. She needed a place with internet access. She had to act fast but didn't know where to go or what to do. The hospital offered free Wi-Fi in certain spots, but she would stand out too much there and the library would be the same. She couldn't afford to rent a hotel room since people thought she was naive. Candace felt alone, with no friends or anyone to help her. She fought back tears. Then a raindrop landed on her nose, surprising her. She looked up, and another drop hit her forehead. She knew she needed to find some shelter. Moments later, she was standing with her bike in heavy rain, feeling lost. She was surrounded by nice homes filled with families, but she felt utterly alone. "Candy, oh my gosh, what are you doing out here? Come inside before you catch cold." Candace jumped at the sudden voice and looked down into the kind eyes of Greg's mother. His father appeared beside them, holding a big umbrella. She stared at them in disbelief. How did they find her? "Marion, take her inside. I'll take care of her bike," the man said gently, handing her the umbrella. The woman took Candace's hand and led her away from the bike as George kept it steady. With Marion's arm around her, they walked past 2 homes and up to the front door of a lovely ranch-style house. George followed behind and wheeled the bicycle into the garage. Once inside, Candace saw one of the coziest homes she had ever been in. Marion helped her take off her helmet, trembling from the cold. "You're freezing! George, fill the bathtub with hot water!" Marion called out as she eased Candace's backpack off. George quickly went to help. "How did you get so muddy?" Marion asked softly, brushing twigs and leaves from her hair. She looked into Candace's eyes. "Did you fall off your bicycle?" The warmth and care in the woman's voice made Candace lose her grip on her emotions, and she began to cry as the stress of running away washed over her. Marion wrapped her arms around her, and Candace held on tightly, shaking as tears streamed down her face. "Mom? What happened?" Candace jumped slightly when she heard Greg's voice from the other side of the room. "Go back to bed, Greg. Your friend had a little accident on her bicycle and got caught in the rain. I'll be with you in a moment," Marion replied to her son. Candace quickly wiped her watery eyes but saw Greg's worried look before he turned awkwardly to leave with his crutches. Just then, his father walked in. "The bathtub is filling." "Dear, please hang up your dressing gown on the hook behind the door for later," Marion said, and he stepped out. Marion bent down to untie Candace's shoelaces, taking off her sneakers. Then, she guided her across the room and into the hall leading to the bathroom. Once inside the small space, she accepted a dressing gown from her husband, gently urged him to go, and closed the door. "Let's get you out of these wet clothes and see if you have any marks worse than scratches," the mother said softly. They carefully removed the wet clothes, and Marion frowned at the number of small cuts, but assured her that none were serious. Candace felt surprisingly comfortable with the woman, even in her vulnerable state. Next, she helped Candace slowly get into the hot water. The bathtub was smaller than the one in her mansion, but the warmth was cozy, and the feeling of care was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Suddenly, Candace realized this was her last night pretending. Tomorrow, everyone would know she was not who she seemed. She would be alone and disliked, and that thought made her heart ache. Tears began to flow again. "Hey, it's all right. You're going to be okay," Marion comforted her. "No, it's never going to be okay again," Candace stammered, her sobs choking her. "Shh, Take it easy, you're not alone, Marion said, and Candace shook her head as she cried. I'm so alone, and tomorrow everyone will hate me. Marion knelt beside the tub, stroking Candace's hair and making soft sounds to soothe her. What's going to happen? She asked gently. Candace looked up with tear-filled eyes, trying to calm her breathing. All the PP people will know not I've been faking. Tears continued to flow down her cheeks as she gasped for air. Marion looked at her closely but kept holding her hand, gently stroking her head. What have you been pretending about, dear? The BBB brain damage? Candace admitted, trying to hide her face from Marion. Marion blinked in surprise but remained calm. Can you explain why you did that? Candace turned her face back to Marion and wiped her tears. The night of the accident, I heard Daddy tell the doctor to leave the scars. He's always disliked me. He wanted me out of his house. She looked into Marion's eyes. I didn't know what it really meant back then, but I sensed he was planning something terrible. He knew I was smart and was worried about me, so I felt I had to go. She stared at the water. Pretending to be hurt was my only idea to stop him from sending me away. She took a deep breath and exhaled slowly to calm herself before speaking again. Daddy still dislikes me, but now I think I disgust him. He just ignores me otherwise. Her eyes widened in wonder. The way other people reacted surprised me. They were so nice. I didn't expect that. She looked at Marion again. Before, I had no friends. I struggled to talk to people, and everyone treated me coldly because I was a Tafferty. I was awkward and defensive, mostly just lonely. Now, people talk to me and smile. I learned how to listen and communicate. I made friends. Her expression turned sad. But now, no one would want to be my friend. No one will believe me. Marion touched her arm. I'm confused. Why did you want to stay in that home if he treated you like that? Candace wiped her face with water and then looked at Marion. Over time, I figured out Daddy's plan. The employee pension fund. He's going to take it. The plan is happening tomorrow, but he changed the numbers to make the money go to his account instead. He's also moving the company's money at the same time to another account as he leaves for French Polynesia. His lawyer and the sheriff are helping him for a share. She locked eyes with Marion. I have to stop him. How? Marion asked, surprised. I have proof. I'm going to make sure he gets caught. I'm going to protect the workers and the company. Only I can do it. Her expression darkened. But once I do that, everyone will know I wasn't honest about my condition. Tears came back to her eyes as she thought about how lonely her life would become. She covered her face, knowing she couldn't go back to how things were before. It's true. People will be surprised and hurt. Some may react badly to feeling deceived, but most will understand if you can protect the workers and the company, especially if you truly apologize for it, Marion said gently. Candace peered at Marion through her fingers. I don't dislike you, and you shared with me, Marion said with a smile. Candace shook her head. I've hardly talked to you. I've been dishonest with others for 2 years, she said sadly. It won't be simple. Apologize. Be patient. Understand their feelings, and some will surprise you. Treasure those moments and understand that some people may not be strong enough to move past them, Marion said. There was a soft knock on the door. Marion frowned at the interruption and turned toward the door. Don't open that door unless you're ready for what might happen next, she said firmly. Sorry, dear, but the news says our guest is missing from the hospital, and there's some troubling news about her, came the voice from outside. Marion rolled her eyes and looked back at Candace, who was watching her with concern. We'll keep you safe here tonight. We won't tell anyone where you are. Candace relaxed a little. We should find out what this news is about your brother. He tried to run me over with his car. He crashed into the neighbor's pool house, but I got away after I fell off my bike. He was drinking, but the sheriff won't do anything, just like last time I was hurt. Cal never has to face the consequences of his actions, Candace said bitterly. Why would he do that to you? Marion asked in disbelief. Candace looked at Marion with tear-filled eyes. He blames me for our mother's death, just like Dad does. Marion leaned back in shock. That wasn't your fault, she exclaimed. How could anyone be so heartless as to blame a child for birth problems? Candace felt overwhelmed by Marion's kindness and began to cry. She squeaked when Marion kissed her forehead. They hugged over the edge of the tub, with Candace's head resting against Marion's shoulder. I'm sorry you've been through so much. Please know you're safe with us now, Marion said gently, and Candace held on a little tighter as she sniffed. The voice came through the door again. Should I call someone? George Hughes, don't do that. Just wait until I come out, Marion scolded. Oh, okay. Marion then gently held Candace's face in her hands and looked into her eyes. You relax in the tub, and when you're ready, there's a towel there to dry off. I don't have any clothes for you. My backpack, Candace said. Ah, I'll get that for you. There's also a robe you can wear. She pointed to the towel and robe. Take your time. I'll wash and dry your wet clothes. Marion picked up the wet clothes from the floor, smiled warmly at Candace, and left the bathroom. A moment later, the door opened slightly to place the backpack on the floor. Then Candace was alone in the cozy room. For the first time she could remember, she felt herself truly relaxing. She looked around at the pictures on the walls and the comforting decorations. The warmth of the room and the heat of the water helped her unwind, and soon her eyes began to droop. The tub was too small for her to slip under the water, so she rested her head back and closed her eyes. She felt. Greg sat on the edge of the couch, his legs stretched out in front of him. He watched as his parents talked quietly together. You know I'm an adult now. I should be part of these conversations, he said, a bit frustrated. They both looked at him with a hint of guilt. His mom nodded and came to sit beside him, while his dad took a seat on his favorite chair. Candace needs our help, his mom started. Didn't the news say she was missing from the hospital? Greg asked. His mom nodded. She needed to leave because she has something important to do tomorrow. Greg felt confused. He couldn't think of anything Candace might need to do that would make his mom act this way. I'm going to tell you something, but I need you to stay calm and think carefully, she said. Greg's eyebrows raised. The whole situation felt more and more strange. Candace isn't struggling with her mind, she explained. Greg frowned. What do you mean? She's been pretending since the night of the accident, his mom continued. Greg shook his head and his thoughts turned to Crystal, making him feel angry. Like her sister, he said sharply. No, it's not like that at all, his mom shouted, surprising him. He hadn't expected her to react this way. Candace didn't do this for selfish reasons. She was trying to stop her father from putting her out of the house. She made herself a legal dependent. It sounds like she didn't have a good home life with her father and brother against her. She must be really strong to stay in that situation, she insisted. Should we call the hospital? Greg's dad asked. No, no one can find out Candace is here. Tonight we're giving her a safe place to stay. Tomorrow is another matter, their mom said firmly, staring at Greg's dad until he nodded. Then she turned to Greg, and he felt he had to agree. He had never seen his mother so determined before. Do you trust me? She asked Greg directly. Yes, he replied without hesitation. His mom never lied to him, and she had a better sense of people than he did. He wished he had encouraged Crystal to spend more time with her, so his mom could have warned him. He realized he had been ignoring the signs about Crystal. Although he was still puzzled by Candace's behavior, he knew he could trust his mom's instincts. He sighed. Where will she sleep? He asked. His mom smiled at him proudly, and that felt good. Could she sleep in your bed? She suggested, and he was taken aback. Not with you. You would sleep on your father's recliner, of course, she added quickly. His dad chuckled, as if he knew what Greg was thinking. Greg shot an annoyed look at his dad, who just smiled back at him. George said another place for dinner, his dad said. That's supposed to be Greg's job, he replied with a frown. Not while he's using crutches, Marion said with a hint of mischief. In my day, we worked through our injuries. I helped with the chores all while limping around, George exaggerated. His wife rolled her eyes. You've never had a real injury. The closest you got to a cow was the picture on your milk carton, and the only crops you dealt with were in your cereal. Don't forget that I grew up on a farm, George. Oh, Mom's using your full name, Dad. Better give in now, Greg teased. George puffed up and ruffled Greg's hair as he headed into the kitchen to grab some utensils. His mom turned her attention to Greg. I changed your sheets today. You haven't made a mess of your room since you got back, have you? Greg feigned shock. How could I? It's only been 2 hours, she chuckled. You've made bigger messes in shorter time." Acting hurt, Greg sighed dramatically. "Oh, you've wounded me, Mother. I'll just go back to my room and make sure all my secret stuff is hidden." His joke made his mom laugh, and he dropped the act, smiling. Greg carefully lifted himself onto his right leg and positioned his crutches. His mom stayed close to make sure he was steady. He glanced at her. "I'm being super careful. Once I get the hang of these, I'll zoom around the house." Marion smiled but rolled her eyes. "I know you want to be active, but you have to heal. It will be tough being held back like this." "Yeah, I'm already feeling it," he admitted, frowning. "Be patient. I know you can handle this," his mom said, looking him in the eye. He nodded back at her. "And remember to keep an open mind about Candace. What she went through was difficult. We need to support her. She'll need friends now that people found out she was pretending to be someone else," she continued. Greg nodded. "That still surprises me," he said quietly, then awkwardly made his way down the hall to his room. He caught a glimpse of the bathroom door and thought about meeting Candy outside. Now he wasn't sure how real that moment had been, and it left him unsettled. He entered his room and looked around. He had only joked about hiding things, since the internet was more reliable for that. He felt a bit nervous about having her in his space. The first time Crystal came over, she noticed a sock under his bed and jokingly called it his fun sock. He didn't quite understand what she meant, and it made him feel a bit uneasy. After that, he made sure to keep his room tidy. Thinking about his ex-girlfriend was upsetting, so he tried to forget her, but then he thought of Candace. He remembered what she had told him the last time they saw each other at the hospital. She wanted him to be her boyfriend. He wondered if that was real or just part of someone else's plan. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He knew he needed more time to heal from Crystal's betrayal. It still hurt a lot. Now Crystal's sister was going to stay in his room. That made him a bit uncomfortable, but he trusted his mom's feelings about it. He opened his eyes and looked toward the door. Candace stood there, looking at him with a mix of nervousness and hope. Her pink hair was slightly wet, and she wore his dad's old robe, which felt a bit odd. But he could not overlook how beautiful she looked. For a moment, everything else faded away. How could anyone want to harm her? But his heart reminded him that he had been misled before. He turned away, feeling a pinch of sadness. "I'm sorry," Candace said softly. He almost didn't catch her quiet apology. When he looked back at her, he saw that she seemed ashamed. He moved closer, and she lowered her head even more. Without thinking, he gently lifted her chin so he could see her eyes again. They held a glimmer of hope. "I'm not upset with you. I was just thinking about Crystal's betrayal. Mom tells me you've been acting differently since your accident, but she believes there's a good reason behind it. I haven't always trusted the women in your family, but I trust my mom's judgment, and she supports you." "So, I do too." Candace beamed, and a tear slipped down her cheek. He instinctively wiped the tear away before realizing what he had done. His face turned red as he pulled back. "Sorry, I think dinner is ready. Will you join us?" He looked away, feeling embarrassed. "Yes," she replied. He noticed her backpack and said, "You can leave your bag here since you'll be sleeping in my room tonight. I'll be on the recliner," Greg stammered, his cheeks feeling warm. Candace giggled, her eyes sparkling. He stepped back to let her in. "I need to change," she said quietly. He nodded and pointed to the hall. "We'll be in the dining room." He hurried away, only noticing the door close when he was almost to the restroom. His mom looked up when he came in, raising her eyebrows as she noticed his blush. "She's really pretty," Greg muttered before he could stop himself. Marion smiled at her son. "I wouldn't say too pretty, but she is quite lovely." Greg felt a little pain in his leg and winced, but his mom noticed. "Take your seat. Dinner is ready," she said, giving his arm a gentle pat. He nodded and carefully settled into his chair. It felt good to sit. "Is it time for your next pill?" Marion asked. "I'll wait until after dinner. I'm not sure how long I can stay awake," Greg replied, exhaustion creeping in. His mom lovingly ran her fingers through his hair before returning to the kitchen. His dad walked into the dining room and sat down, smiling at Greg. "We have quite the lovely guest. I know you'll be a gentleman while she's here," he teased quietly. Greg glanced at the doorway and shot a look at his father. Of course. "Stop teasing Greg," Marion said as she came in with their plates. She placed the dishes on the table and gave her husband a firm look before heading back to the kitchen. Candace appeared in the doorway, looking a bit shy. Greg turned and felt his heart race as he noticed her in a fitted pink shirt and a skirt. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out until he cleared his throat and shook his head to focus. "Please take a seat," Greg stammered, pointing to the chair across from him. She smiled and moved to sit down. Greg glanced at his dad, who seemed a little flustered too. His mom came back with the last plates, noticing the expressions on the men's faces before sitting down. She placed a plate in front of Candace and then took her own seat. "Is the house warm enough for you, Candace?" she asked, noticing that Candace seemed a bit chilly. Candace looked at Marion and nodded slightly. "I packed in a hurry and didn't grab warmer clothes," she said softly. Marion glanced at George and Greg. "Start eating." With that, she stood and signaled for Candace to follow her into the kitchen, leaving Greg and his dad behind. "You're in for a long night," George finally said quietly, giving in to his urge to tease his son. "Dad!" Greg exclaimed, feeling embarrassed and turning to focus on his meal. A few minutes later, his mom returned with Candace beside her. Greg's eyes widened again as he noticed her black tights with flames on them around her calves. She still wore the snug shirt, but she had on his black running jacket, which was only partly zipped. It couldn't close over her figure completely, but it covered her well. She looked warmer. Who was he kidding? She looked amazing. His mom took his surprised expression as disapproval. "You won't be needing your running outfit for a while, and this jacket is nice and warm," Marion said firmly. He shook his head slightly as he looked at her. "No, it's all good," he replied, trying to sound calm. Candace's nervous smile turned to one of happiness as she watched him. They sat down at the table, and Greg tried hard to focus on his meal. He was very aware of how good Candace looked in his favorite tights. Now, he wished he had chosen different underwear as he felt awkward in his loose track pants. The conversation was light, but Greg struggled to concentrate through the growing discomfort in his leg and the tiredness he felt, especially with Candace sitting so close. He felt a sharp throb in his leg just as his mother stood up. "I think you need a pill now. Then it's time to relax in the recliner," she said. He nodded and pushed himself back from the table. He caught a glimpse of concern in Candace's eyes and forced a smile as he carefully moved to the bathroom to brush his teeth. Afterward, he returned to the living room. His mom was nearby as he settled into the recliner and let out a sigh of relief. Marion handed him the pill with a glass of water. He took it and leaned the chair back to stretch out. His mom draped a blanket over him and kissed his forehead. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured sleepily. "Sleep well, Greg." She watched as he closed his eyes and then walked back to the dining room. Candace looked a bit tired too, but Marion had a few questions. "Who will you report this to?" she asked. Candace met Marion's gaze. "I know an agent in the FBI who handles these situations. I'll give him full access to all the files I've gathered and let him know the schedule. The transfer is set for 10 a.m. tomorrow, but the money won't stay in the accounts your father set up. I arranged for it to move into new accounts I created to return it to the pension fund and the company. He won't have access to those. I'll inform the investment firm of the new accounts once the transfer is done. When your father finds out the money is gone, he won't react well. Since the sheriff is involved, he might look for you. We should be careful," Marion said, and George's eyes widened. "We should involve the state police," he suggested, and Marion nodded. Candace smiled and stifled a yawn. "And that's your cue to get some rest, young lady," Marion said kindly. Candace smiled back at them. "I'm sorry for pulling you into this. I just don't have anyone else." Tears started to fill her eyes. Marion moved closer and hugged her gently. She softly calmed her and kissed her on the forehead, which made Candace smile a little. "Come on, get some rest. We'll handle everything in the morning," Marion said kindly but firmly. Candace stood up and let Marion guide her down the hallway to Greg's room again. "We'll see you in the morning." "Sweet dreams," Marion said, and Candace managed a shaky smile and nodded, unable to speak. With the door closed behind her and the room lit by a small desk lamp, Candace looked around. This was the first time she had spent time in a boys' room. She took a deep breath and caught Greg's familiar scent. It gave her a little thrill. Fighting another yawn, she moved to the bed and pulled back the covers before settling onto the mattress. She felt a little sore from a fall off her bike, but the warm bath had helped. As she snuggled under the covers, she breathed in again. The sheets were clean and soft, and the comforter still held Greg's comforting smell. If she wasn't so tired, she might have considered exploring her feelings, but she didn't want to risk making a mess. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself drift into a deep sleep, feeling warm and safe. After a restless night, Byron's mood worsened with each passing minute. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, but with the deadline for the funds transfer approaching, he felt doubt creeping in. It was too late to change the transfer details, and even checking the accounts could raise questions, so he had to stay hands-off until it was done. He had been careful and left nothing to chance, but this was the first time someone from the Tafferty family had mishandled company funds. This thought made him frown. "Byron, relax! You're making me nervous, and it's already tense enough," Byron's lawyer, Preston Mathers, said in frustration. Sheriff Todd Winslow entered the room with a grim expression. Preston looked at him in annoyance. "What's your problem?" The sheriff ignored the lawyer and focused on Byron. "Your son is dead." "What?" Byron said, shocked. Todd looked at him sternly. "He lost control of his car and crashed into the Gordon estate, driving through a wall and into the pool. He didn't get out in time and drowned. On top of that, he hit Hal Gordon's wife, Belinda, as he crashed. She's in the hospital with broken bones. Lucky for her, it wasn't worse. Hal is furious." Byron felt overwhelmed. The timing felt too coincidental. He would have to stay for the funeral, and today was supposed to be his departure. Byron's thoughts drifted to his son and why he had been driving so carelessly. He knew Cal had a drinking problem, but this was too much. The sheriff continued. "There's still no sign of your daughter. She left the hospital yesterday afternoon and vanished. Where could she have gone?" Byron snapped back at the sheriff. "Like I understand what goes on in her head." "It's time." Byron and Todd looked at Preston, who signaled to his watch. With a dismissive look at the sheriff, Byron turned on his laptop. Once on the desktop, he opened his offshore accounts. He logged in and clicked on Account Summary. The two accounts he had set up appeared, and seeing the balances filled him with relief. One account held his pension money, and the other had business funds. A slow smile formed on his face. He was a very wealthy man. He shared a relieved smile with Todd and Preston. "Now it doesn't matter what happened in the Gordon's pool, right?" Byron smirked, and Todd chuckled in agreement. Preston looked at the screen anxiously. "Byron! The money!" Byron glanced at Preston, puzzled, then looked back at the page. His heart sank as he saw the balances read 0. What? He refreshed the page, but a login prompt appeared. He stared at it, confused, then entered his details again, but received a message saying his password was wrong. He tried once more, being careful, but was denied access again. "What's going on?" Todd asked, his face reddening. "I've been locked out of my account," Byron said, his voice tense as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "I didn't deal with your nonsense for years just to lose out today. I want my money," the sheriff shouted. Byron turned to him, frustrated. "The money is gone! Someone took it!" he yelled. Todd let out a harsh laugh. "I think you're trying to pull something here. You planned this to keep it all," he yelled, then drew his firearm and aimed it at Byron. "You're going to give me my money now." "I can't access the account," Byron shot back. "You have other accounts, personal ones, and my price just went up to $5 million. Get to your bank and transfer the funds," Todd demanded. Byron, feeling angry, logged into his bank's website, only to find a message saying his accounts were frozen and he needed to visit the bank to resolve the issue. His face went pale. "Unbelievable," he muttered quietly. "Don't you dare tell me there's no money," Todd yelled. "Seriously, Todd? Calm down," Preston said, raising his hands to soothe the man. As Preston got between Byron and the sheriff, Byron pushed the lawyer into Todd. The gun fired, and then Byron punched Todd in the head, stunning him. Byron followed up with a kick, making Todd drop the weapon. Todd grabbed a lamp from a table and hit Byron on the side of the head, pushing him back. Blood flowed from the cut on Byron's forehead. Preston fell to the floor, holding his stomach in pain, but he landed on the gun as Todd knelt to pick it up. He struggled to get up as Byron ran out of the room. "Call! An ambulance!" the injured lawyer said to Todd, gasping. The sheriff considered shooting him again. "Call yourself!" He quickly left the room to chase Byron. He was determined not to let him escape. On the floor of his study, Preston struggled to breathe. The pain in his stomach was intense, but his anger gave him the strength to crawl to his desk. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911. "Hampstead Hills Emergency Services. Please tell me what your emergency is," the operator said. "I've been shot. Send. An ambulance. Preston Mathers, 17 Oak Lane. The sheriff shot me," he managed to say. "Stay calm, Mr. Mathers. Help is on the way. Is Sheriff Winslow still there?" Preston felt weak. "No, chasing Byron. He's dangerous. Stay with me, Preston. Help will be there soon. Preston?" In the bright and cozy kitchen of the Hughes home, Candace sat between George and Marion as they watched money transfer into Byron's overseas accounts and then into the accounts she had created. She reset her father's password to keep him out. Meanwhile, George was speaking with the FBI agent Candace had found to help take Byron down. The agent seemed surprised to have a whole case handed to him. He got the bank to freeze Byron's assets since Candace had shared his personal banking information. Marion was talking to the state police, reporting that the sheriff was involved in a scheme to steal money from the mining company. Candace had sent them a link to her evidence so they could investigate and take Sheriff Winslow in for questioning. Candace glanced across the table at Greg, who was watching her with a silly smile. She noticed he looked a bit dazed from pain medicine. He had woken up in pain from sleeping on the chair, and she felt sorry for him. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm just really glad your sharp mind is okay," he said with a sigh. Candace felt her cheeks warm as Greg continued to look at her with admiration. Marion heard his words and turned to look at him closely. "Papa, our boy is feeling the effects of his medicine." George looked over and sighed. "Yes, and he seems quite taken with someone." Candace glanced at George, who was smiling warmly at his son, whose face was turning red. Marion turned to her husband. "Don't tease Greg." Candace then spoke to Marion. "I need to call Mr. Bagley at the investment house that manages the employee pension fund. He must be worried since the funds haven't moved to the new pension plan yet." Marion nodded, so Candace dialed the number. After it rang 6 times, she heard a noise as the man dropped the phone. "Hello?" he answered curtly. "Mr. Bagley, this is Candace Tafferty." "Candace? Oh, Candy, this isn't the best time to talk. My father mismanaged the employee pension fund, so you haven't received the money for the new package." There was silence on the other end. Then came some startled breaths, and she continued quickly. "It's okay. I made sure he couldn't take the money. It's ready to go into the new account. Can I confirm the account number with you?" Candace asked. "Who is this?" he questioned. "It's really me, Mr. Bagley. Can I read you the account details?" she asked. "I thought they said." "I know, I'm sorry. I had to pretend so I could find out what my father was planning. I wanted to stop him." "My goodness. You really have the pension funds?" he asked with hope. "Yes, sir. Can I confirm the account?" she asked again. Yes, please," he urged. Candace carefully read the numbers and letters, and when she finished, she heard him sigh. "That's right, Candace. I'm transferring the funds now," she said and started the transfer. Soon her screen showed her pension fund balance was 0. "It's done." For a moment there was silence. Then she heard several people breathe a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Candace. I don't know how you did it, but thank you. This started as one of the worst days of my life, and now you've saved it," Bagley exclaimed. "I'm glad to hear that. I need to reach Mr. Stevens now because my father also took the company's working capital. That needs to be returned as well." "How could he do this?" he asked, sounding angry. "He was planning to escape to an island in French Polynesia. I canceled his flight tickets, too. He can't leave now as the FBI wants to talk to him." Mr. Bagley burst into laughter. "You are amazing, Candace. Thank you again." "You're welcome. Goodbye," Candace replied and hung up, smiling broadly at Marion. "That feels great, doesn't it?" her mother asked. "Absolutely. I'll make the next call." She had a bit more trouble getting Mr. Stevens to understand. He was quite upset when he learned there was no cash in the bank. Candace calmly explained what had happened and transferred the money back into the account. The man was much friendlier once he saw the correct balance. She let out a long breath. The company needs a new policy for handling these transactions. Even someone like Tafferty shouldn't be able to take out that much money without proper approvals, Candace suggested. But it's Byron's company, Mr. Stevens said in surprise. Not for much longer, Candace replied. Have a good day. Candace leaned back and relaxed. George was talking quietly with their FBI contact. When he finished, he smiled at the others. A team of investigators will arrive later this afternoon. Is there anything else to do? Marion asked. I want to go check on Missy and Crystal at the hospital, Candace said, looking at Marion. I think it's better to wait until the authorities have gathered the sheriff, your father, and his lawyer. They currently don't know where you are, and we should keep it that way for now. Missy and Crystal are safe at the hospital, and I'll call to find out how they're doing. Does that sound okay? Marion suggested. Candace nodded with a smile. Please ask for the head nurse, Margaret Stewart, she added. Marion put her phone on speaker, dialed the hospital, and asked for Margaret. The call was forwarded to the nurse's station, and Marion heard the nurse's voice. She sounded busy. Nurse Stewart speaking. Hello, this is Marion Hughes. We brought our son Greg home yesterday, Marion started. Oh, yes, Mrs. Hughes. Is everything all right with Greg? The nurse asked, sounding worried. Marion smiled at her caring tone. Yes, well, he had a tough night, and we gave him one of his pills this morning. He seems to be feeling very energetic now, Marion admitted. If they're too strong, you can cut them, the nurse suggested. Pharmacies have tools to do that safely. Thank you. We'll try that, Marion said. Is there anything else? The nurse asked, sounding distracted again. I was curious about how Missy and Crystal are doing, Marion asked, and Candace moved closer to hear the response. Margaret sighed. I'm afraid I can't share any details with anyone but family. Oh, please tell me, Candace said into the phone. Marion gave her a cautious look. Candy, is that you? Margaret asked urgently. Yes, I'm safe, but please don't tell anyone where I am, Candace responded, giving Marion an apologetic glance. Why? What happened? The head nurse pressed. Dad took money from the company's employee pension fund and the working capital. I stopped him from taking it, returned it, and informed the FBI. You need to keep Missy and Crystal safe from him and the sheriff. They will be very upset, she said nervously. You sound different, Margaret said, sounding uncomfortable. I'm sorry I had to pretend to be someone I'm not, but it was the only way to stay close to him and find out what he was doing. I'm truly sorry. You were always so kind to me. Candace's voice shook with emotion. Take it easy, Margaret said gently, then sighed. When this is over, we need to sit down and talk, Margaret said. Candace took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. I would really like that. There was a brief silence before Margaret continued. I'll have someone from security watch over your mom and sister. They are both recovering and will be with us for a few more days. Thank you, Candace replied gratefully. I need to check on some things. I'll talk to you later, Margaret said, then ended the call. Marion looked at Candace. No more calls until we catch the troublemakers. Candace nodded and hoped they would be arrested soon. She really wanted to talk to Margaret. Byron hurried inside his family home, glancing at the family portraits that hung on the walls. They seemed to judge him, making him feel angry. He rushed to his office. He needed to act quickly. The trouble he caused earlier would slow things down, but he knew Winslow would arrive soon. He needed to grab the cash from his safe and his travel bag, then leave town fast. Something had gone wrong with his plans, but he would think about that later. When he opened the safe, he paused in shock. He remembered putting $20,000 there just a week ago. Then he realized Cal had been in his office when the safe was open. Cal had come in to argue about his allowance. Byron suddenly felt certain that Cal had taken the cash when he wasn't looking. He grabbed his handgun and a box of bullets from the safe, putting them in his jacket pocket. Cal might have hidden the stolen money in his room, as he was not very clever. Byron took his travel bag and hurried up the stairs. On the steps, he noticed something that made him stop. There was blood. Had Cal been hurt on his way out? As he continued towards Cal's room, he saw more blood on the carpet next to Candace's bed. He stepped inside, hoping for a different sight, but the mattress was partially pulled away, and there were signs of a struggle, with blood and something else on the floor. There was also a small weight nearby with blood on it. Candace had been here. It looked like Candace had fought Cal, and she had won. Byron's mind raced with thoughts about Candace, but he had no time to think further. He searched Cal's room for the missing money, but found only a few crumpled bills. Disappointed, he stuffed them in his pocket before rushing back down the hall. Byron! He pulled out his gun and shot towards the front door as he turned to run to the back. Winslow yelled in anger and fired back, but Byron ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the shot as he escaped through the patio door. He ran around the side of the house, hoping to find Todd, but he was nowhere to be seen. Just before Byron reached his car, the sheriff showed up at the front door. Byron took another shot, and Todd quickly ducked back inside, narrowly avoiding the bullet that grazed his leg. Byron jumped into his car and started the engine. He fired another shot at the door as Winslow peeked out, trying to aim. Sirens were getting louder, so Byron drove over the curb onto the lawn and headed for the fence at the back of his property. There was a path behind it that would take him out of the neighborhood. Suddenly, a bullet shattered his back window. Byron steered his car toward a fence panel between two posts, crashing through it with a loud bang. He quickly straightened the car on the narrow path and sped away. He knew he would need to switch cars soon, since his was now too noticeable. He was on the run and had no money to start fresh. "Oh no!" Todd shouted in anger as he limped to his cruiser, just as 3 state trooper cars pulled into the driveway. In his frustration, he fired at the first car without thinking. The 3 officers spread out and blocked the way. Feeling desperate, he reached into his car for his shotgun, but just as he pulled it out, he was hit in the shoulder by a bullet that knocked him around. The gun slipped from his hands. The next thing he knew, 3 state troopers had him pinned down, taking away his remaining weapons. They turned him over and put handcuffs on him. "Suspect in custody. Medical help needed," one officer said into his radio. "Byron, Tafferty, got away!" He gasped, feeling pain in his shoulder. "You just focus on your situation, buddy," a younger officer replied with a smirk. The sheriff sat on the ground, feeling defeated. It wasn't fair. Years of dealing with Byron's problems, and this was how it ended? He had kept Byron in power, ensuring his own job. The last few years had been tough, and now this was the outcome? Oh no. By 10 p.m., the FBI agents were finally wrapping up and heading back to their cars. They had spent the day talking with Candace in the Hughes living room, going through every detail she had documented about her father's illegal money schemes and how she had stopped them. The fact that money was moved from the company's accounts to Byron's personal ones was proof of his wrongdoing. Even though Candace returned the money to the correct accounts, it didn't change the case against Byron since he didn't know what she was doing. The letters she collected between Byron and his lawyer explained their plan, which ended with the money in his offshore accounts. It was expected that he would transfer the sheriff's and lawyer's shares into their offshore accounts, but the money was gone before that could happen. Agent Louis Jefferson was the FBI investigator Candace had chosen, and he was the last one still in the house. The other agents had taken down the lights and cameras used to record her statement and packed away all their gear. "Thank you for your help in sharing what your father did. I'm really sorry for what you've been through. It shows what a strong young woman you are," Louis said as he shook her hand. Candace smiled back at him in appreciation. "I understand that Sheriff Winslow is in custody and your father's lawyer, Preston Mathers, died at home after being shot by Winslow. Your father is still on the run, but there's a statewide alert out for him and a warrant for his arrest has been issued. We know he might be dangerous since he and the sheriff exchanged fire at your home. We would like to offer you protective custody until he is found. You're a key witness," the agent said earnestly. Candace looked to Marion and George and they both nodded in agreement. "I think that might be a good idea," Marion said. "Just until it's safe." Candace stepped forward and hugged Marion. She leaned in to whisper in her ear, "Thank you for believing in me when you could have doubted." Her voice shook with emotion. Marion squeezed her gently, then pulled back to smile. Her eyes were a bit misty. "I've always trusted my instincts. I knew you could be trusted. You come back the moment it's safe. Greg will miss you." Candace gasped in surprise, her cheeks turning red. She smiled shyly at Marion. "Can I say goodbye to him?" Marion had sent Greg to rest in his room after he had fallen asleep following lunch. "Yes, just keep it calm. He's still not fully recovered," Marion advised, locking eyes with Candace. Suppressing a big smile, Candace nodded and then turned to Jefferson. I'll go with you, but I need to say goodbye to Greg first. Can I also stop by my house to pack a suitcase? Of course. I'll be outside making arrangements, he replied. Then he turned to Marion and George. Thank you both for looking after Miss Tafferty. It was our pleasure. After all, she's like family, George said, grinning. Marion playfully elbowed him, and he acted dramatically surprised. What? It's clear as day. Marion rolled her eyes at her husband's joking as Candace hurried down the hall, her face warming with excitement. She took a few deep breaths and gently knocked on Greg's closed door. Hearing a noise, she opened the door and stepped inside. She moved closer to the bed and saw that Greg was asleep. She frowned, certain she had heard him say something. The blinds were closed, but the light by the bed was on. In the soft glow, she saw his eyes were shut. She also noticed the covers were lifted. Candace. Greg was dreaming of her? She wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to embarrass him, but really wanted to say goodbye. It felt risky. She didn't want him to think she couldn't be trusted. That would be terrible. She turned back toward the door, but the handle squeaked. What? She turned again and saw him looking in her direction, blinking away sleep. Candace? What are you doing? He asked. The FBI is putting me into protective custody. I wanted to say goodbye. What? Wait, you're leaving? He said, sitting up quickly. She moved closer to him to help calm his worries. Just until they catch my father, I'll be back. He took a slow breath. Oh. Good. I'd like that. Me too, she said with a smile, and he was watching her closely. She wished she could kiss him, but feared she might startle him. Then he leaned in and brushed his lips against hers, and she felt as if she might melt. The first touch was gentle, but the second one took her breath away. He kissed her softly, making her feel warm inside. He pulled back and looked into her eyes. You aren't just playing with me, are you? She saw the hurt from his past in his expression. No. I want you to be my boyfriend. I want to be with you. I want to know everything about you and share everything, she said, her hand resting on the covers. He gasped in surprise, his eyes wide. I won't hurt you. I would never. Greg kissed her again, and she felt herself drawn to him as warmth filled her. He wanted her too. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Greg pulled back so they could catch their breath and looked into her eyes. You're my girlfriend. I'm your boyfriend. I will wait for you, he promised, holding her gaze. It's all I've ever wanted, she said with a big smile. I should go. Your mom told me not to be too excited, but that's so hard. Greg smiled and nodded. The feeling is mutual. Candace stood quickly and walked to the door, glancing back before leaving. Greg still seemed a bit flustered, and she bit her lip, wanting to stay. Come back to me soon, Candace, he said, his voice filled with emotion. That surprised her, and she nodded, unable to respond. Stepping outside, she saw Marion leaning against the wall, smiling kindly. Candace nodded to her mother, and together they walked to the front door, where she gave George and Marion a quick hug. She stepped outside and followed Agent Jefferson to the SUV. When she got into the back seat, she looked at the agent in the front. They need to find Dad fast. For Greg, winter passed slowly as he healed. He took his classes online while his friend Tim carried a tablet for him to join in through the video. Spring came with the hope of warmer weather, but instead brought cool temperatures, rain, and cloudy days. He was well enough to return to school, though it was tiring. He was happy when the cast came off, even though Tim teased him about the cane he was using. It was pink and a gift from Candace, and he used it with a smile. Candace was still somewhere safe and away from trouble. There had been no news about Byron, and the legal case against him was moving slowly, keeping Candace from coming home. They had weekly video calls to catch up, but instead of making them feel better, it just made them miss each other more. Over the next 2 months, Greg worked hard to regain his strength. By summer, the sun returned, the days grew warmer, and Greg was finally back to his favorite activity, running. He started with shorter distances. Tim ran with him as graduation approached fast. Pete said Valerie is being hard to get. He asked her to the prom, but she hasn't said yes yet. Greg chuckled. You asked Heather, right? The day they announced it, Tim said with a smile, and Greg grinned back. Tim then looked at him curiously. Any news from Candace? Greg frowned and shook his head. I asked during our last call and she said she'd see what she could do, but I haven't heard anything since. Tim smirked. I heard Crystal is still without a date. Not a chance, and thanks for bringing that up, Greg said, picking up his pace. Tim laughed but struggled to keep up. Hey, I was just joking. They ran in silence for a while, then Tim spoke up. Heather feels really sorry about your breakup. She wanted me to tell you. Greg glanced at his friend and saw the awkward look on his face. He knew Heather probably asked him to say it, but he also knew Tim truly cared for Heather and wanted to keep peace between them. He sighed and nodded. Please tell Heather it's okay. I'm not upset with her, he said, then grinned at Tim. But I expect to be asked to be the best man at your wedding. Tim stumbled in surprise, so Greg slowed down to walk. Tim still looked worried. What, I haven't told anyone I plan to ask her? Greg laughed. Come on, it's so obvious. You two are in love. You're headed for a wedding. Tim looked at Greg's happy face and relaxed. Does anyone else know? He asked, clearly worried that Heather might hear before he could ask her. I doubt it. Most people here don't pay much attention to others. I'm just someone who notices these things, Greg replied. Mr. Romance, Tim said with a smile. When are you going to ask her? Greg asked. Tim paused, thinking about it. I was thinking after graduation. We planned to go camping and... He stopped when he saw Greg's serious look. Is there anything stopping you from doing it sooner? Greg asked. No, I have the ring. Don't you think Heather would love to share this news with her friends at prom and before graduation when everyone is about to start new adventures? Greg asked. Tim blinked as he realized Greg was right. Heather would love that. Wow, I didn't think of that. You really are Mr. Romance. Greg shrugged with a proud smile. They turned and started heading back. After Tim returned to thoughts of how he would propose that evening, he noticed Greg was no longer smiling. He realized that Greg's comment about people not noticing others applied to him, too. He felt bad for not recognizing his friend's struggles. I really hope Candace can come to prom, Greg said. Tim noticed Greg's surprise and the worry on his friend's face. Thanks, Tim. So do I, Greg replied, smiling back. Everling's banquet hall looked amazing for the evening's celebration. The graduating students wore beautiful dresses and sharp suits, and the music already had some guests dancing. For many, this was a chance to show off their style and readiness for the future, even though they were still young. Many students would soon head to college, some even in different states, so tonight was also a time for goodbyes. Tim and Heather were surrounded by their friends. Heather was glowing as she showed off her engagement ring. Everyone was happy to see it finally happen. The football players were there, some looking a bit uncomfortable in their rented suits, but their dates looked stunning in their dresses. The ladies shone brightly against the backdrop of the boys' ill-fitting suits. When Crystal Tafferty arrived, everyone noticed her striking beauty. She wore a lovely green dress that sparkled under the lights. Unfortunately, not everyone watching was smiling. The Tafferty name had taken a hit after Byron's problems, and many were worried about their future because of it. Parents would have had a tough time losing their jobs and pensions, and their kids might have worried about going to college. Crystal felt the effects of Byron's actions, even though she had nothing to do with his plans, and had suffered because of him. Then there was how she treated Greg, which everyone at school knew about. It had become a topic of gossip, much to Greg's embarrassment. Tim spotted the redhead standing a little ways inside the entrance. He noticed she looked uneasy with the unfriendly looks directed at her. He took a deep breath, preparing to help her, but then he stopped. At the entrance stood a striking woman in pink. Tim heard Heather quietly gasp as she noticed Candace Tafferty, too. The tall woman wore a dress that hugged her figure and revealed a bit too much, which was partly hidden beneath her soft pink hair. Tim smiled as Greg entered the hall to stand next to Candace. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she smiled shyly back at him. They shared a sweet kiss, announcing to everyone that they were together. Greg wore a sharp suit that looked perfectly fitted to him, much more fashionable than what his classmates had on. Tim knew from running with Greg that his leg was all healed up and he was back in great shape. The couple moved further into the hall, and everyone watched in surprise as they stopped next to Crystal and smiled at her. When Greg offered her his other arm, there were gasps from the crowd. Crystal looked surprised, but accepted his arm. They paused for a quick photo with Greg between the two women before joining Tim, Heather, and the others. "Good evening, everyone," Greg said with a big smile, and the group responded with soft greetings. He continued, "I'd like you to meet my girlfriend, Candace." The voices were more lively as she nodded and smiled happily, though a bit shyly. Greg turned to Crystal, who looked up at him with anxious blue eyes. "Everyone knows my friend Crystal. If I can move on, I hope you all can too," Greg said, looking at his teammates and their companions. He glanced back at Crystal and noticed she was close to tears. "Hey, no tears. It's prom, so let's see those smiles," he said cheerfully. Crystal nodded and managed a shaky smile. He nodded back and then turned to Candace, who gently held his face and kissed him. When she pulled away, he felt a rush of happiness and grinned at her. "I missed you too," he replied softly. This lightened the mood with his friends, who cheered in approval. They were blocking the hallway, so they moved into the main area to find their tables. The decorations looked lovely, and the dance floor seemed inviting. Greg was excited for the night. Later, when Candace arrived at Greg's house in the late afternoon, he was waiting by the door. He quickly pulled her into his arms and kissed her. They stayed close for a long time, and when they finally pulled away, they both smiled widely. That was when he noticed she was holding two garment bags. One was for her prom dress, and the other was a suit she had brought for him. She remembered how handsome he looked when he walked into the room wearing the suit. Marion was beside her and hurried to hug her son, who seemed so grown up. She had taken some pictures to send to George, who was away on a business trip in Belgium. Candace used his room to change into her dress, while Marion fussed over her, taking pictures of them together. Candace could see the warmth in Greg's eyes, which made her heart race with joy. They said goodnight to Marion and jumped into the waiting limo. The driver took them to Candace's house to pick up her sister, Crystal. Candace felt a bit nervous about this part since Greg and Crystal had some history together. During their chats, Greg admitted that Crystal was important to Candace, so he could forgive her, but a sincere apology would be nice. Candace promised to make sure her sister took responsibility for her actions and apologized properly, which seemed to satisfy Greg. Candace's own prom had not gone well, but she was genuinely enjoying Greg's. They danced and spent time with Greg's friends, filling the night with laughter and excitement. As the party began to wind down, Candace and Greg told their friends that the celebration would continue at her place if anyone wanted to join. Tim and Heather were in, as were Valerie and Pete, while the others had other plans. Candace, Greg, and Crystal got back into the limo, and the others drove in their cars. They parked in front of the large house, and Candace led everyone inside. Tim gazed at the old portraits lining the walls with wide eyes. "This is quite a sight," Crystal laughed. "Yeah, Mom is planning to donate them to the local museum." Pete noticed something missing. "Where's the painting of your dad?" Crystal shook her head. "Thankfully, there isn't one." Missy appeared at the top of the staircase with a cheerful smile. "I heard you all downstairs, so I wanted to say goodnight before going up," she said, as she walked toward the long staircase leading to the second floor. "Good evening, Mrs. Tafferty. We'll try to keep it down," Tim said politely. "Oh, just call me Missy. Don't worry about the noise. This big house could use some life," she exclaimed, waving her hands at their worried expressions. "I'm sorry. Forget what I said. Congratulations and have fun." With that, she smiled and headed up the stairs. Candace watched her leave with a sad look, and Greg squeezed her hand, drawing her back to him. She smiled and hugged his arm. Noticing the group's interest in the mansion's decor, Crystal decided to give them a tour. Greg and Candace walked at the back of the group. The lounge, known as the trophy room, was filled with pictures of the family's happy moments. They were there to remember the good times. Tim noticed a football in a glass case right away. Crystal saw his interest and smiled. "That's the winning ball from Cal's championship game," she said. Everyone turned their attention to Candace. They all knew about the difficult history between her and Cal. Candace approached the glass case with a sad smile. She lifted the lid and picked up the ball, which was a bit flat. She looked at Tim. "This ball represents the best time in my brother's life. He had a lot of potential back then. He was starting to struggle with drinking, but it wasn't the main part of his life yet, and he wasn't as smart as you," she said, grinning slightly as she tossed the ball to him. Tim caught the ball and smiled back, but then his smile faded when he felt how flat it was. "It really needs air," he said. Candace smiled again. "There's a ball pump in the garage on the back wall." Pete smiled brightly and hurried off when Candace pointed to the last door in the hallway. As they continued through the room, they looked at the photos on display while Crystal read the captions. Many pictures were from the opening of new mines. Crystal smiled and pointed to an old black and white photo of men standing in front of a mine. "This was the first mine the Tafferty family opened. It started everything. It closed years ago, but I remember visiting the museum before it shut down." "Who is running the company now that your dad is gone?" Valerie asked, a bit awkwardly. Crystal glanced at Candace, who smiled shyly. "The board of directors manages the company, and the administrative team handles daily operations, but I am now the main shareholder. It should have gone to Missy, but the prenuptial agreement was tough to overcome. We couldn't find a way around it. Dad lost his shares because of his actions. The shareholder agreement protects against any illegal activity that could harm the business. The shares go to the next of kin, which should have been Cal, but came to me instead." "You're also the CEO," Crystal added with pride, holding her sister's gaze. "She's too shy to say, but the board chose her to take over Dad's position after she insisted on changes to the rules to prevent this from happening again." Greg looked at Candace, surprised. She smiled at him and bit her lip. "That's amazing," he said, beaming. "Is this something you wanted to do?" Her smile grew wider, and she nodded. "There is a lot of good we can do for the community that the company used to support before my mother passed away. Daddy stopped wanting to help others after that. Pete came back with the pump and helped Tim blow up the game ball until it looked good as new. They kept touring the area and ended up on the deck behind the building. They could see the pool, the garden, and a large lawn." "That's a lot of grass to cut," Tim said. "Yeah, it's almost as big as a football field," Pete replied, then ran off into the darkness. Tim exchanged a funny look with Greg, then shook his head. Suddenly they heard a loud noise, and Byron appeared from the shadows of the pool house, moving quickly toward them. He was holding something in his hand. He didn't seem well. His hair and beard were messy, and his clothes were dirty. Even from a distance, he had a strong, unpleasant smell. His eyes looked wild as he focused on Candace. "I knew you'd show up," he shouted with a strange smile. "You've been staying in the pool house?" Greg asked, looking for a way to calm Byron down. "What? No. I heard she was at Everling's banquet hall, so I came here to settle things," Byron said, ending with a nasty grin. "I can't believe you still have people around here looking out for you after everything you've done," Greg said as he moved in front of Candace, making Byron growl. Tim pulled back his arm and threw the football right at Byron's head. It hit him with a funny doink. Byron staggered, his head snapping to the side, but he didn't fall or drop what he was holding. The football bounced off Byron's head and flew toward Greg, who instinctively caught it and held it close. Seeing Byron start to focus on Tim, Greg moved away from Candace and Crystal, trying to keep Byron's eyes on him. "Ha!" Greg shouted. "I can catch anything thrown my way even when it hits an old grump," he boasted, tossing the ball up and down. Byron shook his head to clear his thoughts and aimed in Greg's direction just as Pete rushed in from behind. The loud noise echoed as the football burst. Pete tackled Byron to the ground, and the older man hit his head on the patio. Tim rushed in and stepped on Byron's wrist, making whatever he was holding slip away. He checked on Byron and saw he was out cold. He pushed the gun away with his foot and noticed Greg was still standing, so he looked at Pete. "Wow, it hurts a lot less when I'm wearing protection," Pete said, wincing. His shoulder was injured, and there was a little cut on his ear from where Byron had shot. Valerie hurried over to check on him. Heather was on the phone calling for help. He quickly moved to Greg, who was staring at a tear in his jacket sleeve with wide eyes. Greg took it off, revealing a small cut on his shirt where the bullet had grazed his skin. Candace helped Greg remove his shirt. The cut was not deep and was only about an inch long. Greg looked at Tim, managing a shaky smile. Just a little scratch. Sirens approached the front of the mansion, and Missy followed the officers through the house to the back patio, where they took charge of the situation. The sheriff's team had been investigated and let go, so the town relied on a squad of officers for now. I heard a gunshot, Missy shouted, staring in shock at Byron on the ground. She gasped as she noticed Greg's injury and rushed over to him, her eyes wide in surprise as they took in his bare chest. Candace smiled at Missy's embarrassed look, knowing she felt guilty for staring at her boyfriend. Medics arrived and quickly checked on the injured. Byron had a broken wrist and was still unconscious from hitting his head. They wrapped Greg's arm, told Pete to come with them to the hospital, and then left with Byron on a stretcher and an officer escorting them. Great job! You really surprised him with that throw, Greg said to Tim, falling into their usual playful banter. The tall blonde grinned and nodded slightly. Yes, it was a good throw. Your catch was excellent as well. Greg nodded back at Tim. Thank you. They turned to Pete, who was smiling widely despite the pain in his ear. Nice tackle, Pete, Tim said calmly. Indeed, Greg added. Pete laughed, then quickly regained his composure. Thank you, gentlemen, he said, pretending to speak with formality. The ladies watched them with puzzled and surprised expressions. Tim reached out his hand to Heather, and she took it quickly. I think we should head home now that the excitement is over. It was a great evening. Greg nodded with a smile, reaching for Candace's hand. She came to his side, and he looked at his friends. So glad you could join us. Valerie picked up the game rules and nodded at Pete, who smiled at his friends. It was a night to remember, he said. Everyone laughed as the tension lifted. Smiling, they walked back inside and approached the front door. After exchanging hugs and handshakes, Greg's friends headed home, while Pete and Val went to the hospital first. Can you tell us what happened at the end? Candace asked. Greg smiled and nodded. Tim and I had this idea from when we used to play football. If the game got too rough, we would pretend to be polite after each play to help us calm down. It eased the stress and helped us think clearly. He pointed toward the backyard. That was pretty intense. It seemed like the right time to use it. Candace wrapped her arms around Greg and gave him a grateful kiss. When she pulled away, she smiled at him, and he felt lightheaded. You saved my life tonight, Candace said. Greg shook his head gently. It was a team effort. Tim did a great job, and Pete helped out. I just tried to keep him busy. Candace held his face in her hands. You stepped in between us and him when he was going to harm us. You focused his attention away from us, putting yourself at risk. Greg smiled. That does sound a bit scary when you put it like that. Before he knew it, he was embraced by Candace, Crystal, and Missy, who all looked thankful. When they released him, Greg felt a rush of emotions. I'll say goodnight. Greg, thank you again for looking out for my family, Missy said. He gave a slight bow. It was my pleasure. She smiled at him distractedly, glancing at his bare chest once before heading upstairs. Crystal stepped in front of Greg. Thank you for accepting my apology. I was a bit selfish, and I'm sorry my worries got in the way. I wish I could have been better for you. You're forgiven. I'm glad you're taking responsibility, he replied with a smile. She nodded sadly. Good night, she said as she went up the stairs. Then it was just Candace and Greg. She took his hands. I've been looking forward to this night for so long, she said with a shaky voice. Greg felt a bit nervous too. Are you sure it's all right for us to be together upstairs? What if they hear us? Candace grinned. Do you think we'll be loud? He smiled back. I hope so. She went up the stairs, pulling Greg along. When they reached her door, she looked back at him nervously before leading him inside. He stepped into the room as she closed the door. A desk lamp bathed the space in a soft glow, showing a well-decorated room with a feminine touch and a large canopy bed. Greg admired the decor and noticed it was a bit messy, with a skirt on the floor. Greg turned to her and smiled warmly. It's you. You look so lovely, he said with a gentle sigh. Candace moved into his embrace, and they shared a kiss that left them both smiling. She led him carefully toward the bed, but his foot brushed against something on the carpet. Glancing down, he noticed a faint mark. She saw it too and looked a bit embarrassed. No one cleaned the carpet after Cal. Got aggressive, she murmured. I managed to stop him, but he fell here. Greg reached out, lifting her chin so she'd meet his gaze. I'm sorry you went through that, but I'm proud of how strong you are. I'm really glad you're here with us, he said, his voice soft. Candace gave him a grateful smile and pulled him toward the bed. They lay down together, smiling as they settled comfortably. Greg gazed at her with admiration, noticing her unique beauty and strength, and he teased her lightly, making her laugh. "Your laughter is the best," he said warmly, enjoying the happy moment. The two shared a quiet, gentle embrace, each feeling grateful to be together. Greg looked at her warmly and sighed. "You're beautiful." Candace felt herself blush but couldn't stop smiling. She moved closer to him on the bed and they shared a laugh together, enjoying the warmth and joy of the moment. Greg settled beside her, and they lay there quietly, holding each other close. He brushed a lock of hair away from her face, gazing at her with admiration. "I'm glad we're here together," he said softly. Candace smiled back, feeling a comforting happiness as they simply lay side by side, sharing the peace of the moment. Greg gasped, looking at her with a mix of surprise and warmth, and she smiled. "You're amazing," she said softly. Greg's face showed a touch of shyness. "You really think so?" he asked, his tone hopeful. Candace nodded. "Of course. I think every part of you is special," she said with a grin. "I want to make you happy." He chuckled softly, touched by her enthusiasm. "Oh? And how would you do that?" She thought for a moment, then replied, "I just want us both to feel close and happy together." Greg's eyes softened. "I'd really like that too," he whispered. With a gentle smile, she reached out, holding his hand, and they stayed close, enjoying the quiet, shared moment. Candace felt a wave of excitement as her heart raced, and she looked up at Greg, who was smiling warmly at her. "Come here," he said gently, and she moved closer, wrapping her arms around him as they shared a warm embrace. Greg looked at her, a spark of joy in his eyes. They stayed like this for a moment, both feeling the closeness, happy just to be together. Greg softly brushed a strand of hair from her face and held her gaze. "Being with you feels amazing," he said with a smile. Candace returned his smile, feeling safe and cherished in his arms. They shared a peaceful moment, simply enjoying each other's presence, both grateful for this connection that made them feel so alive and happy. Candace's sudden outburst of joy made Greg smile in relief as they held each other close. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, her heart racing from the strong emotions flooding through her. In that moment, what she cherished most was the overwhelming sense of closeness and trust between them. It was a depth of connection she hadn't expected but had longed for more than she realized. As she looked up, she saw Greg's warm smile and heard him say, "I love you, Candace." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Hearing those words touched something deep within her, and unexpectedly, tears filled her eyes. She hugged him tightly, resting her head against his shoulder. Greg stroked her hair gently, surprised by her tears. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. "Did I say something that upset you?" Candace shook her head, unable to speak for a moment as she worked through her emotions. Finally, she managed to say, "These are happy tears." Relieved, Greg looked into her eyes. "I'm glad," he whispered. "But what brought them on? It seems like this meant a lot." Candace took a steadying breath and admitted, "I felt so alone for so long." Greg remembered how she often kept her real thoughts hidden from others. He realized that deep down, she'd been searching for genuine love and acceptance. "I love you, Greg," she said, her voice sincere. Greg felt a warm rush of happiness at her words as they both relaxed, basking in the quiet joy they had found together. After a peaceful silence, Greg asked gently, "But couldn't you talk to Missy and Crystal about any of this?" Candace brushed away a tear. "I wanted to, but whenever they tried to be kind to me, Dad would punish them. I kept my distance to keep them safe." Greg's expression softened with understanding, realizing just how much she had endured alone. "I had no idea things were that difficult for you." He kissed her again softly, as if to reassure her that she was safe now. They shared a gentle smile, finally feeling at peace. "You still look big, even when you're not excited." He remembered Heather's accidental comment, which showed him that Crystal had shared too much about their closeness. This memory no longer made him feel angry or let down. He had accepted that some people share private moments with their friends. Maybe he was the strange one for not wanting to talk about it. "Does that bother you?" he asked again. She shook her head, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "So, you like big guys?" Greg said confidently, watching her eyes widen as she smiled and nodded. Suddenly, there was a loud bump at the bedroom door. They exchanged glances before Candace jumped out of bed and hurried to open the door. "Crystal, oh!" Candace gasped as she saw Missy on the floor, trying to pull up her pants, looking very embarrassed. There was something next to her on the floor. Greg went to the door with Candace, holding his shorts to cover himself. "Missy, why were you outside my door?" Candace asked softly. "I'm sorry, Candace, I'm so embarrassed," Missy said, covering her face with her hands and starting to cry. Candace looked at Greg, who silently offered to leave, but she shook her head. He stared at her with confusion as she knelt beside Missy. "You felt lonely too, haven't you?" she asked kindly. Missy peeked at Candace from behind her fingers, her eyes filled with sadness. She nodded. "Dad was often mean to you," Candace continued. This broke Missy's composure again, and tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry, Candace. I wanted to be a good mother to you, but Byron was always so angry when I tried. The last time, he hurt me badly." A shudder ran through her. She looked at Candace with pleading eyes. "Can you forgive me? I'm a coward and you have been so strong." "There's nothing to forgive. I know what you went through with him. I didn't want you or Crystal to suffer because of me. He was the one at fault," Candace said kindly as she took Missy's hands. "Dad is gone now, so you can start fresh. You can meet new people." Missy's lip trembled as her tear-filled eyes met Candace's. "No one around here wants to be my friend because of him. Byron married me just so he could show off, and I'm ashamed to say that's all I've ever been. My mom put me in beauty contests since I was little, and I've relied only on my looks. I don't have any other skills, and I'm scared I taught Crystal to think the same." She took a few shaky breaths, trying to hold back her tears. "I don't know how to begin anew, and I can't afford it because I have no savings. Byron made sure I depended on him." Candace sighed and kissed her forehead. "Please know you are always welcome here. You're my family, and I care about you." Missy hugged Candace's hands and pressed her forehead against them, tears rolling down her cheeks. Candace exchanged a worried glance with Greg. He nodded and tilted his head toward the item on the floor near Missy, silently asking what she had been doing by the door. Missy smiled at him and nodded, but then paused as she looked at Candace. She caught Greg's gaze, glancing at the item he was holding. He looked down, then back at her, a worried expression on his face. "Missy, let me help you back to your room. We can talk more in the morning," Candace said gently. Missy nodded and managed to stand up, feeling embarrassed. She bent down briefly to gather her things as she noticed her toy lying on the floor. She quickly picked it up and squeaked in a mix of surprise and shyness. Candace wrapped her arms around Missy, guiding her down the hall while Greg stayed behind. When Candace returned, she closed the door softly and hugged Greg tightly. Pulling back, Greg studied her closely. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Candace smiled, kissed him, and led him back to bed, taking the item from his hands and letting it drop to the floor. They settled on the bed, lying side by side, facing each other. "You love me?" Candace asked softly. "I do," Greg replied right away. She smiled back at him. "I love you too," she said, giving him a gentle kiss. "While I was away, we never finished our talk about your plans after graduation," she mentioned. "I'm going to help with the family business, but what are your plans? You said you were going to the local college?" Greg nodded, his gaze warm as he looked into Candace's blue eyes. "Yes, I got accepted into their computer sciences program. I want to study data security." "Are you going to work with your dad?" she asked. "No, his job requires too much travel. I don't want to be away from home like that. It would be tough on Mom," Greg admitted. Candace smiled and nodded. "You want to stay home while you go to college to keep your mother company?" Greg observed her closely. "That was my plan. Is something bothering you?" "No. I care about your mother and I want her to be happy. I had never thought about how challenging it must be for her when your dad is away," Candace confessed. Greg could tell she was thinking deeply, but he didn't quite understand what was on her mind. Her eyes met his again, and she smiled shyly. "There's a lot of loneliness, and only one Greg." His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I was planning to ask you to move in with me while you went to college, but now I realize that wouldn't be fair to your mother," she said with a sad smile. She gently placed her fingers on his lips, signaling him to wait as she had more to say. "I want you to think about something else. When your dad returns from his work trips, how about spending your nights here?" Greg considered this and quickly nodded. "That sounds good. I wasn't planning to stay at home forever after I graduate. Eventually, I need to move out. My dad needs to find a way to be home more often. He can't keep doing this." Candace smiled brightly and kissed him again. They leaned back, and Greg felt a bit surprised when Candace touched him softly. "It feels good just like this, too," she said with a laugh. "It won't stay like this for long," he replied with a playful look. She looked down and then back at him, her eyes showing a hint of worry. "There's something else I want you to think about." Greg noticed her nervousness. "Tu broke up with Crystal," he said, trying to focus. Candace shook her head. "Crystal is going to college and will fit in well with her friends. She is young and will be okay. But I'm talking about Missy. She doesn't have anyone else and feels lonely." Greg pulled back slightly, surprised. "But I'm your boyfriend. Don't you want that?" he asked. "I do. More than anything. I'm so thankful you opened your heart to me. I'm happy I can share my feelings with you," she said quickly. "But are you saying I should be there for Missy too?" he asked, still confused. Candace placed her hand gently on his chest. "I want to keep loving you and learning about you. Everything about you shows me how wonderful you are, full of love and not afraid to show it. Your parents' affection for each other shines in you, and I truly want your love in my life. I want to share many moments with you, through closeness and also just enjoying time together." Greg felt a wave of relief. These were things he wanted too. Candace took a calming breath and looked into his eyes. "None of that would change if I also care for someone else. I'm not asking you to be Missy's boyfriend. You are mine. But Missy needs that kind of connection. I heard from Crystal that Missy has some items to help her feel better, but that's not the same as real closeness." Greg looked back into her eyes and saw the love there. He realized she was serious, but he remembered a past experience that made him cautious. "I feel uneasy about this idea," he admitted. "I promise you I am not using you like Crystal did. I would never risk what we have now that I've finally found someone special. If you feel this isn't something you can do, I understand and will respect your decision. But I also believe your heart has so much to give. I truly appreciate that you've let me in. I promise I will always be honest with you," Candace said gently. He looked at her and could see that she meant every word. He also felt her affection for him. A strange feeling began to grow inside him, and he realized he needed her close. He leaned in and kissed her deeply while holding her close. They shared a special moment together again, this time with a sense of urgency, as if they were claiming each other. Greg was full of energy and focus, while Candace held on tightly. She felt joy and let out a happy sound. Greg felt his own happiness soon after as he looked into her eyes, seeing her connection and need for him. They kissed again, this time in a gentle and sweet way. Greg turned to lie beside her, and she cuddled up next to him. This was what Greg had always hoped to find. Someone who cared for him just as deeply as his mom loved his dad. Candace was right. He was following the example of his parents because he admired how much they cared for one another. His relationship with Candace was not the same, but that didn't make it less meaningful. It was just different. He still wondered if bringing another person into their relationship was the right choice, but he felt more sure of Candace's feelings for him. That gave him hope. "We'll talk to Missy in the morning," he said softly to Candace. She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining with love. She kissed him softly and snuggled closer. Candace felt warmth spread through her as she realized how much Greg loved her. She knew he was sincere. For him, love was a vital part of who he was. He had opened his heart to her and showed that he was willing to face challenges for their relationship. That was the biggest sign of trust. His love and trust made her feel less alone, something she had felt for a long time. It was the best feeling ever. Greg loved to run. Every day for the past month, he ran home from his summer job at the home renovation store. He took the job to save money for college. Even though Candace was financially well off, he liked to support himself. Currently, Candace was riding her pink bicycle beside him, cheerful streamers dancing from her handlebars. On nice evenings like this, she would meet him at work and ride home together. Greg's dad was back in town this week, so he would be spending his nights with Candace. They entered her neighborhood, following the smooth road until they passed the Gordons' house. A new glass enclosure was built over their pool, and a row of stones protected the area from passing cars. Candace waved to Belinda Gordon, who smiled back. Soon, Greg and Candace reached the long path leading up to her house. The mansion was grand and spacious, almost too large for the small Tafferty family, but it had always been their home, so they stayed. As they approached the front entrance, Missy opened the door with a wide smile. Her eyes sparkled with joy, and she greeted them warmly. Candace had just returned from putting away her bike and took off her helmet, revealing her bright yellow-blonde hair with pink-tinted ends, which would linger for a while as her natural color grew back. Candace walked up the steps, and Missy gave her a welcoming kiss on the cheek as she stepped inside. Greg followed, and Missy closed the door behind them. Looking around, Greg noticed that the old, stern portraits of the Tafferty family had finally been removed. Missy had sent them to the town museum, clearing away a reminder of the past. Crystal left for her tour in Europe this morning, Missy mentioned, smiling. She's going to stay with the tour group, right? Greg asked, sounding a little concerned. Missy gave him an amused look. Yes, she promised to stay with them. She'll check in with me every night to let me know she's all right. Greg nodded, his worry easing, and noticed Candace looking at him fondly. What? I just want her to be safe, he sighed. Candace stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him and giving him a quick, sweet kiss. Well, I think it's time to get you upstairs and out of those sweaty clothes for a nice, relaxing shower. Greg smiled, and with Missy following, they headed up to the master bedroom. It was a cozy space they often shared when Greg stayed, with the largest bed in the house and a spacious bathroom with a walk-in shower. They stepped into the bathroom, where the warm shower offered a refreshing end to their day. The steam surrounded them as they laughed and chatted, enjoying the comforting, quiet moment together. He wasn't sure why she enjoyed that so much, but it still felt nice for him, and she seemed happy, so he didn't mind. Candace turned his face and kissed Greg deeply. She looked excited as she pressed close to him. He held her gently, feeling a rush of warmth. Pulling back, she looked into his eyes with an intense expression. Let's make this fun! Greg noticed Missy react to Candace's words. With a smile, he helped Missy to her feet and turned her to face the wall. Candace encouraged him, and he took a moment before joining them. Wow! Missy exclaimed as excitement filled the air. Greg felt the energy around them rising as he connected with her. They shared a moment of closeness, and Candace watched with a grin. He held her firmly and moved in sync with her, feeling the thrill grow. They were all caught up in the moment, laughter and joy filling the space. Candace cheered them on, her energy infectious as they continued. The sounds of happiness filled the room, a joyful noise echoing around them. When it was time to pause, Greg lifted Missy up, turning her to face him, a smile on his face. Her cheeks were flushed, but she looked pleased. He leaned in to kiss her softly, and she returned the gesture with a smile of her own. Afterward, Greg helped her out of the shower where Candace was waiting with a soft towel. They wrapped it around Missy and gently dried her off. Missy nodded, ready to take care of herself now. Candace sat down carefully, needing a moment to recover. Greg knelt beside her, holding her hands gently, offering her a comforting presence until she felt ready to move. Once she felt steadier, he helped her up and guided her to sit on the edge of the countertop. They shared a warm hug, and Greg leaned in to kiss her with genuine affection, expressing his happiness at simply being there with her. They both smiled, taking in the warmth of the moment. Missy came over, placing a towel around Candace's shoulders and one for Greg. Don't be too long now, she said with a smile. Dinner is almost ready. As Missy left the room, Candace and Greg exchanged a warm look, enjoying the peaceful, cozy moment. He leaned down, giving her another gentle kiss, which left them both smiling. I love you, Mr. Hughes, Candace said softly, her eyes bright with happiness. Greg's grin widened, his heart full. "And I love you, Miss Tafferty." They dried off, sharing quiet laughs and happy glances as they readied to head down for dinner. They knew Missy would appreciate their company and didn't want to keep her waiting. This new life arrangement was bringing them all closer. Greg was able to spend time at his own place, often with Candace there to keep him company, and Candace had formed a close bond with his mother. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company, which made Greg all the more grateful for the way things had turned out. Candace had found new friends in the community too, which was a big change. After her father had been sentenced to jail for life, she'd held a press conference to address the town, explaining how she'd pretended to be less aware to learn more about her father's plans. Most people understood and accepted her, and although a few held on to old grudges, there was no longer any threat in it. Candace and Greg shared a look of gratitude for all they had now, then headed down to dinner, feeling lucky to have each other and a brighter future ahead. She shared how acting that way helped her see how defensive and unkind she had been before. Now, listening and accepting others made her feel much better. It helped her become a better person. She thanked everyone for their kindness. Greg thought some might not deserve that thanks, but he decided to let it go. The head nurse at the hospital, Margaret Stewart, became Candace's main supporter. She was strong, but she had a heart of gold. As CEO, Candace started to bring back the community support projects that the company used to fund. The county was starting to benefit again from their main industry. She loved her work. Sitting across the table from her, Greg looked into Candace's eyes and saw her love for him shining back. It filled him with so much happiness that he didn't know how to express it. He glanced at Missy, who was sitting at the head of the table, and noticed she was looking at him with warmth in her eyes. He wasn't sure how to respond, but offered her a friendly smile as he felt his cheeks get warm. She let out a soft giggle. His gaze returned to Candace, who was smiling joyfully. She was enjoying his shy reaction. Such a tease. After dinner, he planned to have some fun with both ladies until they couldn't take it anymore. He shifted a little as his pants felt snug. Laughter erupted from the women. Yes, he would have his fun, but could he really call it fun if they were excited about it? Hey everyone! Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.